She didn't argue. She didn't beg. She just stood there while Daniel Mercer ripped the badge off her scrubs and told her she was finished. Two security guards took her by the arms, in front of patients, in front of nurses who looked away, in front of a waiting room full of people who didn't understand what they were seeing. Claire Bennett walked toward the exit with her head up and her jaw tight, carrying nothing but 7 years of combat medicine in her hands and a fury she refused to let anyone see. Then the windows shook. Then the sound hit, rotors, heavy and low, shaking the glass in the frames. Every person in Summit Valley Medical Center looked up. 3 military helicopters swept over Briar Falls and banked hard toward the hospital. The soldiers on the ground weren't walking to the entrance. They were asking for her. If you've made it this far, stay with me. Follow this channel so you don't miss what happens next. Hit like if this story already has your attention and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The morning had started the way most of Claire Bennett's mornings started. Too fast, too loud, and without enough coffee. She'd been on since 6, which meant she'd technically been on since 5:43 because the night shift nurse had a family emergency and nobody else was answering their phone. The ER at Summit Valley Medical Center didn't wait for shift changes. It didn't wait for anything. That was the first thing Claire had learned when she took the job 8 months ago, and it was the thing she had appreciated most, the relentlessness of it, the way there was no room for anything except the work. Briar Falls was a mid-sized city in western Oregon, the kind of place that thought of itself as small, even though it had 2 hospitals, a university, and enough traffic on Route 9 to make you late to everything. Summit Valley was the larger of the 2 hospitals, a sprawling complex of beige concrete and glass that had been renovated twice in the last decade without ever quite losing its institutional smell of disinfectant and recycled air. The ER occupied the entire east wing of the ground floor, 32 beds, 2 trauma bays, and a triage desk that was always understaffed. Claire liked it. That was the honest answer, and she'd stopped being embarrassed by it. She liked the noise. She liked the pressure. She liked the specific mental shift that happened when a critical patient came through the doors, and everything else, every personal problem, every petty grievance, every bureaucratic indignity, just switched off. By 8:15, she had already triaged 11 patients, started 2 IVs, caught a medication error that would have caused a serious adverse reaction in a 63-year-old man with kidney disease, and explained to a very upset father why his son's broken wrist needed imaging before splinting, not after. By 8:40, she was standing in Trauma Bay 1 with her arms crossed, watching Dr. Preston Hale make a decision she was pretty sure was going to hurt someone. The patient was a 44-year-old woman, Rosalind Tupper, brought in by ambulance following a car accident on the interstate. Blunt abdominal trauma, seatbelt sign across the lower abdomen, diaphoretic, tachycardic, pressure trending down. The paramedics had called it on the radio, and Claire had been ready when the gurney came through the doors. She'd already pulled the ultrasound, already gloved up, already positioned herself to run a fast exam the moment they cleared the bay. Hale had walked in behind her and taken over, which was his right. He was the attending. She was a nurse. That was how it worked. What wasn't how it worked was what he was doing now. "I want CT before we go to the OR," Hale said. He was looking at his tablet, not at the patient. Claire kept her voice flat. "Her pressure is 80/50 and dropping. She's got a positive fast in the RUQ. If we take her to CT first, I'm aware of the numbers, Bennett, then you know CT is going to take 12 to 15 minutes minimum, and she doesn't have—" I said, "I'm aware." He finally looked up. He had the kind of face that was used to being the smartest person in the room, or at least used to everyone acting like he was. "Do you have a surgical consult you'd like to share with me? Because last I checked, the MD was on my badge, not yours." The room went quiet in the specific way ER rooms went quiet when a confrontation was about to either escalate or die. Claire looked at Rosalind Tupper. The woman's skin was the color of old paper. Her fingers were starting to mottle. The monitor showed a heart rate of 118. "She's going to code in CT," Claire said. "I've seen this presentation before, more than once." "Good for you." Hale turned back to his tablet. "Call transport for CT." The tech at the back of the room started moving. Claire didn't. She'd learned early in her career, her first career, the one she didn't talk about, that there were two kinds of dangerous situations. The kind where you had time to go through proper channels, and the kind where you didn't. And the skill that separated the people who saved lives from the people who watched them end was knowing, in the first 3 seconds, which kind you were in. This was the second kind. "Get the vascular surgeon on the phone," she said to the charge nurse, loud enough that it couldn't be ignored. "Tell them we have a probable splenic lac with hemodynamic instability and we need them at the bedside." Hale put down his tablet. "Excuse me?" "You can countermand it," Claire said. "That's your call. But I'm telling you what I'm seeing, and I'm documenting that I told you." His face did something complicated. He was angry. She could see that clearly. But he was also beneath the anger, uncertain. Because he'd looked at Rosalind Tupper again, and Rosalind Tupper looked bad. The monitor alarmed. Pressure, 72/44. Hale stood there for 2 seconds. Then he picked up the phone himself. They got Rosalind Tupper to the OR 11 minutes later. The vascular surgeon told them afterward that if they'd gone to CT first, she wouldn't have made it off the table. Claire was charting at the nursing station when Daniel Mercer found her. She'd heard his name before she'd ever met him. Hospital director, 12 years in the role. The kind of administrator who had a reputation that arrived in a room before he did. Efficient, political, not someone who liked being made to look bad. She'd been warned about him twice in her first week, once by a charge nurse who said it with a sigh, and once by a hospitalist who said it while looking over his shoulder. He was taller than she'd expected, well-dressed, the kind of man who wore a tie on a Tuesday in a hospital because he wanted to remind you he wasn't clinical staff. "Bennett." He said it the way you say a word you've decided is a problem. "Mr. Mercer." She didn't stand up. She kept typing. "My office. Now." She saved her charting first. She finished the sentence she was on, because incomplete documentation was how patients got hurt, and she wasn't going to let a conversation with administration create a gap in Rosalind Tupper's record. Then she capped her pen, pushed back from the desk, and followed him. His office was on the 3rd floor, which meant a walk through the hospital that felt designed to be watched. She noticed the looks, from nurses who kept their eyes down too fast, from a physician who suddenly needed to check something on his phone. She'd been in enough situations to know when people were watching you fail in advance. Mercer closed the door behind them. He didn't offer her a seat. "Dr. Hale filed a complaint," he said. "Insubordination, undermining physician authority, interfering with a clinical decision." "The patient survived," Claire said. "That's not the point." "With respect, sir, that's exactly the point." His jaw tightened. "You overrode a physician's order in a trauma bay. You called a surgical consult without authorization. Do you understand how that looks?" "I understand how it looks. I also understand that her pressure was dropping, and I've seen that presentation before, and I knew what was going to happen if we waited." She paused. "I'd do it again." "That is precisely the problem." He moved around his desk, not sitting, standing, using the height of the room. "You've been here 8 months. 8 months. And in that time, I've received 3 separate complaints from attending physicians about your, let's call it your tendency to exceed your scope." "Were the patients harmed?" "That's not. Were any of the patients in those incidents harmed?" He looked at her the way people looked at someone who wasn't playing by the right rules. "You're a nurse, Ms. Bennett. A nurse. Your job is to execute physician orders, not second-guess them, not override them, not go around them because you've decided you know better." "My job is patient safety." "Your job," Mercer said, his voice dropping into something cold and precise, "is what I say it is. And right now I'm telling you that you're finished here." The silence that followed had weight. "You're terminating me," she said, effective immediately. He held out his hand. "Badge." She looked at his hand. She thought about 7 things at once: her lease, her savings, her nursing license, whether this would follow her, whether she had grounds to fight it, whether fighting it would cost more than it was worth. She thought about Rosalind Tupper, who was alive. She unclipped her badge and placed it in his hand. "You can have security escort you out," he said, "or you can walk on your own." "I'll walk," she said. She made it to the elevator before the security guards materialized. 2 of them, young, uncomfortable, not making eye contact. She didn't make a scene. There was no point. She'd learned that too, in her other life, that scenes were expensive, and silence was more powerful than most people understood. The lobby was mid-morning busy, families in waiting chairs, a child eating crackers, a man in a paper gown shuffling toward the bathroom with his IV pole, normal hospital noise, the beep of monitors, the roll of a cart, someone calling a name over the intercom. The guards walked her to the front entrance. One of them held the door. She stepped outside into the gray Oregon morning. The air smelled like pine and rain that hadn't come yet. She stood on the sidewalk in her scrubs with no badge and nowhere to be, and she breathed. She'd been in worse places, much worse. She reminded herself of that. She was still standing there, still breathing, when she felt it before she heard it, a vibration in the ground, low and rhythmic, the kind that climbed up through your shoes before your ears caught it. She looked up. The first helicopter came over the tree line to the north, flying low and fast, military markings visible even from this distance. Before she fully processed it, two more appeared behind it, in loose formation, heading directly for the hospital. Around her, people on the sidewalk stopped moving. Someone said something she didn't catch. A car in the parking lot sat with its door open, the driver standing half out, staring up. The helicopters banked hard and descended toward the hospital's open lot, the downwash flattening the grass and sending loose papers skidding across the pavement. Military. Not National Guard. The markings were wrong for that. Active duty. And not a medevac run either. The formation was wrong, the approach was wrong. These weren't bringing patients. Or not only patients. A convoy appeared at the far end of the hospital's main drive. 3 vehicles, military green, moving at speed. Claire had taken exactly 4 steps back toward the entrance without deciding to when the lead vehicle stopped and a soldier got out. Not a medic, an officer. Full uniform, squared-away posture, moving with the specific efficiency of someone on a timeline. He looked at the entrance. He looked at the 2 security guards who had just finished escorting Claire out. He looked at Claire. He walked directly to her. "Ma'am," he said. "Are you Claire Bennett?" Her voice came out steady. "Yes." "Sergeant Major Walsh, U.S. Army." He didn't offer his hand. His eyes were assessing. Not unfriendly, but focused. "We have a situation, ma'am. We need you inside." Behind her, she heard Daniel Mercer's voice. He must have followed him, or been called down, or come to watch. His voice carried the particular sharpness of a man who had just given an order and was watching it ignored. "That woman has been terminated from this hospital," Mercer said. "She is not authorized to..." Walsh turned and looked at him. Just looked. The sentence died. "We have 37 casualties incoming," Walsh said, returning to Claire. "Special operations personnel. Explosion at a training facility 11 miles east. Multiple critical. ETA 4 minutes. Claire's mind was already moving. She wasn't thinking about the badge she didn't have. She wasn't thinking about Mercer. "What's the breakdown?" she said. "Confirmed blast injuries, minimum 6. Suspected crush injuries from secondary collapse. 2 unconscious on arrival. We have medics on scene, but they maxed out their capability 10 minutes ago." "Burns?" "Yes, ma'am." "Airway compromises?" 2 probable, 1 confirmed." "Okay." She was already turning back toward the entrance. "You have surgical on call?" "Hospital has been notified." "Notified isn't the same as ready." She pushed through the door. The security guards didn't move to stop her. "I need your medics to give me a status on the 2 unconscious patients the moment they land. And I need someone to get me a set of credentials because I am not working without documentation." Walsh was keeping pace beside her, which told her he'd already decided she was the right call before he'd found her on the sidewalk. She filed that away. Behind them, she heard Mercer say something. She didn't stop to find out what. The ER was already starting to react to the incoming notification. Nurses pulling supplies. A physician she hadn't met before looking at his phone with an expression she recognized as controlled alarm. The charge nurse, Deb Farrow, a heavy-set woman in her 50s who had worked Summit Valley for 22 years, met Claire's eyes across the room and didn't ask any questions. "What do you need?" Deb said. "Both trauma bays cleared and fully stocked. Get me the airway cart in Bay 1, and I want blood bank on the phone right now. We're going to need O-neg, a lot of it. Call whoever's on for orthopedic and vascular. Don't wait for the attending to decide. Just call. Claire was moving as she talked, pulling on a fresh pair of gloves. And someone find me a badge or a lanyard with my name on it because I refuse to code a patient without identification. I've got a temp, Deb said, and pressed a paper visitor tag into her hand. It said staff in red letters. It would have to do. The first ambulances arrived 3 minutes and 40 seconds later, slightly ahead of the helicopter because the primary landing zone was the lot adjacent to the ER, and the traffic routing had taken longer than estimated. Claire heard the radio call and was at the ambulance bay door when they rolled in. The first gurney held a man in his late 20s, partial uniform still on, right arm wrapped in field dressing that was soaked through. His color was okay. He was conscious, asking about his team with the specific fractured urgency of someone trained to stay functional under pain. "You're at Summit Valley," Claire said, walking beside the gurney. "What's your name?" "Reyes, Corporal Reyes." "Reyes, you're going to be okay. Who's the worst one?" "In your group? Who's the worst?" He didn't hesitate. "Kavanaugh. He went through the secondary floor collapse." "Is he moving?" "He was when they got him out." The second ambulance pulled in before the first gurney cleared the doors, and then the third right behind it, and then she stopped counting because counting wasn't useful anymore. What was useful was the work. Dr. Hale appeared in the doorway of Trauma Bay 1, saw the incoming wave, and went pale. "There are at least 30 of them," he said. "We can't—" "Start sorting," Claire said. "Ambulatory go to the hallway. Anyone with airway compromise or uncontrolled hemorrhage gets a bay. Everyone else gets a numbered position, and we work down the list." She looked at him directly. "Can you run bay 2? He stared at her for a moment. This woman he'd complained about 3 hours ago, this woman who no longer technically worked here. Then something shifted in his face. Professionalism. Or maybe just the recognition that this was not the moment for anything else. "Yes," he said, "then go." The next 40 minutes had the texture of controlled chaos, the kind that looks like disaster from the outside and feels, to the people inside it, like a very fast puzzle. Claire was everywhere and nowhere. She intubated a patient whose airway was closing from blast overpressure. She caught a tension pneumothorax in a soldier who'd been cleared by a field medic and shouldn't have been. She talked a panicking young nurse through a needle decompression while simultaneously directing 2 others on hemorrhage control. The soldier named Kavanaugh came in last, and he was the worst. Crush injury to the chest and left leg, GCS of 10 and dropping. She could hear the problem before she reached him. Breath sounds unequal, left side silent. She called for a chest tube setup while she was still across the room, and the nurse who brought it was already opening the kit before Claire had snapped her gloves. "Talk to me," she said to the army medic who'd come in with him. He was under debris for approximately 6 minutes, extricated by his team, lost consciousness in the vehicle en route. We had 2 large bore IVs and 2 liters in before arrival. Pressure? 88 systolic, down from 94. She worked fast and she worked clean, and she didn't talk except to give instructions. This was the part she didn't have a good way of explaining to people, the way her mind got quiet when the situation got bad enough. It wasn't calm exactly. It was more like the narrowing of a lens. Everything unnecessary fell away. What remained was just the patient, the problem, and the solution. The chest tube drained 300 milliliters immediately. Kavanaugh's oxygen saturation began to climb within 90 seconds. She exhaled. She became aware, slowly, of the silence that had settled in the corridor outside the trauma bay. Not the quiet of an empty room. The room was full of people. But the specific silence of people who have stopped moving, stopped talking, because something has caught their attention completely. She stepped back from the gurney, pulled off her outer gloves, looked up. The man standing in the doorway of Trauma Bay 1 was in his 60s, with the weathered, compressed look of someone who had spent decades outside in difficult places. 4 stars on his shoulders. A chest full of ribbons. He was flanked by 2 officers and Walsh, who had somehow managed to stay present through all of it. The general was looking at Claire, not at the patients, not at the controlled chaos of the ER around them. At her. And then he did something that made every person in that corridor go completely still. He came to attention. And he saluted her. Nobody moved. That was the thing Claire noticed first, not the stars on his shoulders, not the ribbons, not the two officers flanking him like furniture. It was the stillness. 30-something people in that corridor, and not one of them made a sound. A nurse who had been carrying a bag of saline stopped walking mid-step and just stood there, arm extended, bag hanging. The general held the salute for 3 full seconds. Then he lowered his hand and walked into the trauma bay like he owned the floor beneath his feet, which, in some institutional sense, he probably did. "Bennett," he said. She hadn't moved either. She was standing at the foot of Kavanaugh's gurney with her gloves half off and a chest tube still draining beside her, and she was looking at a man she hadn't seen in 4 years. "General Aldrich," she said. His name was Warren Aldrich. She'd last seen him in a briefing room that didn't officially exist, in a country she couldn't name in polite company, signing off on an extraction that had gone wrong in 3 separate ways before it went right. He'd had less gray in his hair then. She probably had too. "You still can't slow down, can you?" he said. It wasn't quite a question. "Not in a trauma bay, sir." He looked at Kavanaugh, then at the chest tube, then at the saturation reading on the monitor, which had climbed to 94. Something moved through his expression that wasn't quite relief. More like the recalibration of a man who had been worried about something and was now slightly less worried. "How many critical?" he said. 4 that I'm holding close. The rest are serious but stabilizing." She finally pulled the other glove off. "Reyes is going to need an orthopedic consult. His radius is fractured in 2 places, and there may be a compartment syndrome developing. Someone needs to watch his pressures. The soldier in Bay 2, I don't know his name, he had a head lack that needed more imaging than we've gotten to yet." "Dominguez," Walsh said from the doorway. "That's Dominguez. Dominguez needs a CT of the head before anyone decides he's stable." Aldrich was watching her the way he used to watch field reports, absorbing everything, making decisions on a timeline no one else could see. "Who's running this ER right now?" "I am," Claire said. Then, because she was not a person who left important details out, "I was terminated this morning. I don't technically have credentials in this building." A beat. "Is that going to be a problem for you?" Aldrich said. "No, sir." "Good." He turned to Walsh. "Make sure she has whatever she needs." "Yes, sir." From the corridor, Daniel Mercer's voice cut through the air like something thrown. He'd been standing out there since the general arrived, and whatever had kept him quiet for the past few minutes had apparently run out. "General, I don't know what's been told to you, but this woman was removed from this hospital's staff this morning for—" "Mr. Mercer." Aldrich didn't turn around. His voice didn't rise. "I will speak with you when I'm ready to speak with you." Silence. The kind that settles like weight. Mercer said nothing else. Claire heard him take a step back. She kept her eyes on the monitor. The next hour and 40 minutes were the hardest stretch. Not because of any single patient, not even Kavanaugh's, who was the most critical and the most technically demanding, but because of the cumulative weight of it. 37 people. Different injuries, different severities, different needs coming due at staggered intervals, like a machine designed to test a system's breaking point. Claire didn't break. But she wasn't untouched by it either. There was a moment, somewhere around the 90-minute mark, when she stepped into the supply alcove to swap her outer gloves for the 3rd time, and she stood there for 6 seconds with her back against the shelving and her eyes closed. 6 seconds. Then she went back out. Deb Farrow saw it. She didn't say anything, which was the right call, and Claire made a mental note that Deb Farrow was someone worth knowing better. Dr. Hale was working. That was the honest summary of him during those 90 minutes. He was working, and he was competent, and he wasn't fighting her anymore. Whether that was because the situation had made their earlier conflict irrelevant, or because he'd watched her handle Kavanaugh and recalibrated something privately, she couldn't say. It didn't matter. What mattered was that Bay 2 was functioning. By midday, 4 patients had gone to the OR, 2 to the ICU, and the rest were distributed through the hospital in various states of serious but stable. The ambulance bay was quiet. The controlled chaos had settled into the particular exhaustion of an ER that had been pushed to its limit and had held. Claire was at the nursing station, updating the last of the trauma documentation she'd been filling in between patients, when Sergeant Major Walsh appeared at her elbow. "General wants to speak with you," he said. "When you have a minute." "I'll have a minute in about 12 minutes. "I'll tell him." She finished the documentation. She washed her hands. She found a cup of coffee that someone had left on the counter. Cold, but she drank it anyway because she'd learned not to be particular about coffee when she was tired. Aldrich had set up in a consultation room at the end of the ER corridor. Two of his officers were outside the door, which was a degree of security that made the nurses in the hallway visibly nervous. Claire knocked and went in without waiting for an answer. He was sitting at the table with a folder open in front of him, which he closed when she entered. Old habit. She'd always appreciated that about him. He never left classified material visible to people walking through doors. Most senior officers she'd known were sloppy about it. She sat down across from him without being invited to. "You look tired," he said. "I've been up since 5:40. How's Kavanaugh?" "Stable. They'll know more when ortho looks at the leg, but his lungs are clear and his pressure's been holding for an hour. He's strong." "He is." Aldrich leaned back. "He was one of yours, you know. Not directly, but his unit trained with the 7th Medical, and your protocols were part of their certification package." She hadn't known that. She filed it away. "What happened out there?" she said. "The explosion. Training exercise with live ordnance went wrong. We're still doing the full investigation." His expression didn't invite follow-up questions on that topic. "What I need to talk to you about is something else." He opened the folder again, pushed a single sheet across the table to her. She looked at it. It was a personnel document, her name at the top, dates of service, a series of classification markers she recognized. "Why are you showing me this?" she said. "Because in about 20 minutes I'm going to walk out of this room and I'm going to have a conversation with your hospital administration that they are not going to enjoy." He tapped the folder. "And when they ask questions, which they will, I need you to understand what I'm authorized to disclose." She looked at the document again. "Is this the full file?" "Sections 3 through 7 are still sealed, probably permanently." He met her eyes. "But sections 1 and 2 are sufficient for the purpose." She understood what he was saying. She'd spent years understanding things that were said in the space between sentences. "You're going to tell them who I am." "I'm going to tell them enough." He paused. "I should have pushed back harder on your discharge. The way it was handled." "Sir," she stopped him. "It's done. It was the right call at the time for reasons that don't need to be relitigated." He studied her face. "You haven't had it easy." "No," she agreed, "but I'm not dead, and Kavanaugh isn't dead, and the 6 people who went to the OR this morning aren't dead, so..." That got the closest thing to a smile she'd seen from him. It lasted about a second and a half. "The director of this hospital," he said. "Mercer." "What's your read?" She thought about how to answer that honestly. "He's not incompetent. He knows how to run the administrative side. He's just..." She paused. "He's built a culture here where you don't challenge up, where you don't push back. And in a hospital, that kills people quietly, without anything you can point to." Aldrich was quiet for a moment. "The nurse who called us," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "When the explosion happened. When it was clear the casualty count was going to be significant and it was going to land here." He watched her. "We got a call from inside this hospital, 12 minutes before our convoy was in range. Whoever called knew to ask for the Army, knew to give us a detailed patient breakdown, and gave us your name and told us you'd been terminated that morning and that we needed to find you before you left the building." The silence stretched. "I didn't know that," Claire said. "We traced the call to a landline at the nursing station. The charge nurse, Farrow, I think." "Deb." Claire thought about the woman pressing a paper visitor tag into her hand without asking questions. Thought about the look she'd given her across the room when the ambulances pulled in. "She never said anything," Claire said. "People rarely do when they've done something right." Claire looked at the table. She was tired in a way that sat behind her eyes and in the backs of her calves, the specific tiredness of a body that had been running on adrenaline and was now starting to process the bill. She thought about the sequence of the morning, the termination, the sidewalk, the helicopters, Walsh asking her name. She thought about the fact that if Deb Farrow hadn't made that call, If the army had arrived 10 minutes later or hadn't known to look for her, 37 people would have come through those doors with whatever coverage the ER had. Hale, who was good in a controlled situation, but who had frozen for a full 4 seconds when the first wave hit, and a staff that had never managed this volume of critical trauma simultaneously. It was a small thread to pull on. She didn't pull it. "What do you need from me right now?" she said. "Nothing. Go check on your patients. I'll handle this." She stood up. She was almost to the door when he spoke again. "Bennett?" She turned. "For what it's worth, I've been in this job 31 years. I've seen a lot of people work under pressure." He held her gaze. "You're still the best I've ever seen." She didn't know what to do with that. She'd never known what to do with that kind of thing. She nodded once and went back out to the floor. The ER had quieted to its normal register of controlled urgency. A child with an ear infection, an elderly man with chest pain that turned out to be musculoskeletal. The ordinary human business of a hospital afternoon. Claire was checking on Reyes. His compartment pressures were fine, which was a relief, and he was awake enough to be irritated about the IV in his left arm, when she became aware of a shift in the ambient noise of the corridor outside. Not louder exactly, more concentrated, the way sound changes when people are paying attention to the same thing. She excused herself from Reyes and stepped out. Mercer was in the corridor near the nursing station, flanked by 2 men she didn't recognize. Suits, not hospital staff, the specific posture of people who were here in an official capacity that wasn't medical. Aldrich stood across from him with Walsh at his shoulder. The conversation had clearly been going on for several minutes. Whatever Mercer had been expecting from this meeting, it was apparent he hadn't gotten it. His face was the particular color of someone who had walked into a room confident and was now trying very hard to recalibrate. "I'm telling you," Mercer said, keeping his voice low but not low enough. "Whatever her service record says, what happened this morning was a clinical governance issue, and military protocol doesn't supersede Mr. Mercer." Aldrich's voice was quiet and precise. "The patients who came through your doors today are active duty special operations personnel. Their welfare falls under federal jurisdiction. The events of this morning, including the staffing decisions made prior to the incident, are now part of an official military inquiry." The 2 men in suits. Claire looked at them again. She revised her assessment. Not lawyers, investigators. "An inquiry," Mercer repeated, "into the standard of care provided to federal military personnel at this facility," one of the suited men said. His voice had the flat procedural quality of someone who had delivered this exact sentence before. "We'll need access to clinical records, staffing logs, and administration communications for the past 18 months. Mercer looked at them. His mouth moved without producing words, which was the most unguarded she'd seen him all day. 18 months, he finally said. "To start." She watched his face process it. Not panic. He was too controlled for panic, but something close. The look of a man who has spent years building a particular structure and has just heard the sound of someone pulling at the foundation. "I'll need to consult legal counsel," he said. "Of course," the investigator said pleasantly. "We'll begin with the records available now." Claire went back to her patients. She wasn't there for the conversation. She didn't need to be. But she heard from the end of the corridor Mercer's voice one more time, tighter now, the control starting to cost him. "She's a nurse. She was insubordinate. Whatever her background is, that doesn't give her license to undermine—" "Sir?" Walsh this time. Walsh, who had the particular economy of someone who had spent 20 years communicating in high-noise environments and had learned to make every word count. "The general asked me to pass along one thing. The clinical judgment that Ms. Bennett exercised this morning, in both instances, was consistent with the standing medical protocols she helped develop for special operations field medicine, the same protocols that kept your patients alive in the 10 minutes before your physicians were ready to act." Silence. "Have a good afternoon, Mr. Mercer." Claire was at the medication cart when Deb Farrow materialized beside her. The charge nurse handed her a proper hospital ID, not the paper visitor tag, a real badge fresh from the administrative office, with her name and photo and the Summit Valley logo and registered nurse in clean letters beneath it. She looked at it. "How did you get this?" Claire said. I asked, Deb said. Administrator on call owed me a favor. A pause. Also, I may have told her that the general's people would be reviewing staffing records, and it would look better if the nurse who ran the trauma response this morning appeared properly credentialed. Claire looked at her. You called them, Claire said, before they arrived. You told them who I was. Deb reached past her for the medication log, busying herself with something that didn't need doing. I called the emergency contact on file for the military liaison we use when we get active duty patients. I passed along the relevant information. Deb. You want to thank me. Don't thank me in the hallway. She made a note in the log. There are people who've worked here longer than you who haven't figured out when to make a phone call and when to stay quiet. I've been here 22 years. I've seen 3 directors come and go. I know which thing this was. Claire clipped the badge to her scrubs. Does the administrator on call know that Mercer terminated me this morning? She does now. Deb closed the log. I believe she's in a very interesting phone call with the board at this moment. The board. The hospital board. Claire hadn't thought that far ahead yet. She'd been too busy thinking in the immediate, in the clinical, in the next 12 minutes. But Deb had been thinking in the larger structure, the institutional structure. 22 years gave you that kind of vision. How bad is it going to get for him? Claire said. Deb considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. You know what I found in the schedule files 6 months ago, she said, before you got here? No. 2 incident reports that were filed and then disappeared, both from nurses who'd pushed back on physician decisions. One of them left the hospital within a month. She met Claire's eyes. I kept copies. Claire was quiet for a moment. You kept copies for 6 months and didn't do anything with them. I didn't have the right moment, Deb said simply. The right moment matters. Outside, the afternoon light was going the gray gold that Oregon did in autumn. Indirect, diffused, the sun never quite visible, but the sky bright anyway. Through the ER's exterior windows, Claire could see the military vehicles still in the lot, 3 of them, and soldiers moving with the unhurried efficiency of people who planned to be somewhere for a while. She finished her rounds. She checked on Kavanaugh again. He'd been moved to the ICU, sedated, his legs stabilized pending surgery in the morning. His color was better. His numbers were where they should be. She stood at the foot of his bed for longer than was strictly necessary, doing the calculation that you didn't do out loud, the margin between what had happened and what could have happened, measured in minutes and interventions, and a phone call made by a charge nurse who knew when to act. It was thin. The margin was always thin. That was the thing people outside medicine never quite understood. The distance between a good outcome and a catastrophic one wasn't usually large. It was a decision made 2 minutes sooner. It was one person in the room who saw the problem and wasn't afraid to say it. She went back downstairs. The 2 investigators were still in the building. She could see them in the administrative hallway, one of them talking into a phone, the other reviewing something on a tablet. 3 of Aldrich's officers were with them, and at some point in the last hour, the hospital's legal counsel had arrived. She recognized the look, if not the person. The specific wardrobe of someone who got called to hospitals when things were going officially wrong. Walsh found her near the ER entrance. The general wants to know if you'll be available tomorrow morning, he said. What time? 8? Yes. He'd like to do this properly. He handed her a card, the number written on the back in pen, not printed. If anything changes tonight, call that number. She pocketed it. How many of the soldiers were from his unit, Aldrich's direct command? Walsh considered whether to answer that. Enough, he said. She understood. This wasn't just a general who happened to be in the area. Aldrich had come because these were his people, and someone he trusted had been asked to keep them alive, and she had. And now he was going to deal with everything else the way he dealt with all problems, directly, thoroughly, and with the specific weight that came from 4 stars and 31 years. She was walking back to the nursing station when she heard it. Raised voices from the direction of the administrative corridor. Not the controlled tension of a difficult conversation, something sharper. She turned. Mercer was in the hallway, and the administrator on call, a woman named Patricia Osei, who Claire had met twice and had the impression was both efficient and genuinely decent, was standing across from him with her phone in her hand and an expression that had moved past diplomatic. The board is calling an emergency session, Ose was saying. Tonight. The investigative team has made a formal request for... The investigative team has no authority over hospital governance, Mercer said. His voice had shed its usual precision. Something underneath was showing. This is a military public relations exercise, and I will not allow this institution to be... Daniel? She stopped him with his first name, which in their professional context was itself a statement. They've requested the staffing records. They've requested incident reports. And the board has been made aware of... She paused, and something moved through her face that wasn't quite discomfort, more like the controlled expression of someone delivering something they've been holding for a while. The board has been made aware of certain documentation that's come to light today. Mercer went still. What documentation? He said. That's what the session is to discuss. She pocketed her phone. I've been asked to inform you that you're placed on administrative leave, effective now, pending the outcome of the board's review. The hallway was very quiet. Claire was standing 30 feet away, and she was not the only one watching. 2 nurses near the supply room, the receptionist at the ER desk, one of the military investigators who had drifted to the edge of the corridor, phone still in hand, observing with the calm attention of someone taking notes in their head. Mercer turned. She didn't know if he'd been aware she was there until that moment, or if he'd simply decided to find her, but his eyes went directly to her. She met them. She didn't look away. She didn't say anything. His expression was something she couldn't quite read, not rage, which she'd expected, and not embarrassment exactly. More like the look of a man who had made a series of calculations over a long period of time and had just been shown that one of the foundational ones was wrong. He turned and walked down the corridor. His footsteps were even. He didn't slam any doors. Whatever else he wasn't someone who lost himself in the moment. She'd remember that. She went back to the nursing station. She sat down. She pulled up her documentation and started filling in the gaps from the afternoon. Timestamps, interventions, patient responses. The things that would matter in a record and the things that would matter in a review. Deb brought her a sandwich from the break room, wrapped in paper, turkey, no explanation or ceremony, just set it on the edge of the desk and walked away. Claire ate it while she charted. It was good. She hadn't eaten since 5:30 in the morning, and her body registered the sandwich with a gratitude that was almost embarrassing. The ER settled into its evening rhythm. New patients, different problems, the normal turnover of a hospital that didn't know or care about what had happened in its trauma bays that morning. A kid with a dislocated finger. A woman in her 70s with shortness of breath that turned out to be a pulmonary embolism, caught because Claire ordered the CT before the attending had decided whether he wanted to. She caught herself doing it and waited, and he ordered it 40 seconds later, which was good, which was how it was supposed to work. She was 3 hours into the evening when Walsh appeared again. She was starting to understand that Walsh's appearances meant something was shifting. "There's something you should know," he said. She set down her pen. The investigators pulled the incident reports from the last 2 years. He said it quietly, not with drama. Just information, delivered clean. There are 12 of them, all involving nursing staff who raised clinical concerns through official channels. 7 resulted in disciplinary action against the nurse. Not the physician, the nurse. 12. She'd known it was happening. You could feel it in a unit, the way junior staff answered questions too carefully, the way certain people never spoke in interdisciplinary rounds. She hadn't known the number. 2 of those nurses left medicine entirely, Walsh continued. One of them cited this hospital specifically in her exit documents. Claire was quiet. The investigators are treating this as a pattern, he said. Systemic, not individual incidents. She'd known that too, in the way you know something you don't want to examine too closely because you're not sure what you'll do with it. Deb had kept her copies for 6 months. Someone, somewhere in this building, had been watching this happen for longer than that. "Okay," she said. "I thought you should know before tomorrow." "Thank you." He nodded and left. She sat for another minute. Then she went back to work because there was still work to do, and the evening shift was running thin, and 3 nurses were covering an ER that needed 4. At 9:17, she got a call from the ICU. Kavanaugh was awake. She went up. He was a big man, 30-ish, with the particular stillness of someone who'd trained himself to conserve energy in difficult situations. His leg was immobilized, his left arm connected to 3 separate lines, and his face had the washed-out look of someone recently returned from something far. But his eyes were clear. "You're the one who put the chest tube in," he said. His voice was hoarse. "Yes, Walsh told me." He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. "My daughter is 7 months old. She didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say to that. He stopped. His jaw worked. "I wanted you to know that." She nodded once. She went back down to the ER. She finished her shift. She drove home through the Briar Falls streets in the dark, the September air cold through the window she'd cracked because she needed the cold to stay awake. She was in the parking lot of her apartment complex, engine off, when her phone lit up. Unknown number. Oregon area code. She answered it. The voice was male, mid-range, careful. "Ms. Bennett?" "Yes." "I'm calling on behalf of an attorney who represents several of the nursing staff at Summit Valley Medical Center." A brief pause. "I've been authorized to tell you that multiple individuals are prepared to come forward with formal statements about the incident reports, about the climate in the hospital over the past several years." Another pause. "They've been waiting for the right moment." She stared through her windshield at the dark parking lot. "They've been waiting," he said, "for someone who wouldn't be pushed out." She understood then, fully, in a way she hadn't until that moment, what Deb had meant about the right moment. It wasn't just today. It wasn't just the explosion, the investigation, the general. It was all of it together. The termination on the record, the military inquiry, the board session, and now this. A convergence that had been building for longer than she'd been in this building. "Tell them I'll be available," she said. She hung up. She sat in her car for another minute in the dark. Then she went inside, set an alarm for 6, and was asleep before she'd made a decision to be. At 2:14 in the morning, her phone rang again. Not the unknown number, Walsh. She was awake on the second ring. "What is it?" His voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it she hadn't heard from him before. "The investigators accessed the hospital's internal communication records tonight. Email and internal messaging, 18 months back." A pause. "There are documents, Ms. Bennett, correspondence between Mercer and at least 2 senior physicians, about specific patients, about incident reports that were flagged, and then handled." She sat up. "How handled?" "That's what we're still determining." He paused again. "One of the cases involves a patient who died." The darkness in her apartment was complete. She could hear the distant sound of a truck on the highway 2 blocks over, the small, settling sounds of the building around her. "What was the name?" she said. "We don't have authorization to release that yet." Walsh's voice was careful in the way it got when he was giving her exactly what he could and no more. "But I can tell you that the family filed a complaint with the state medical board 14 months ago. It was reviewed and closed without action." She thought about that. About the specific weight of a complaint filed and closed, about the family on the other side of that closure. "Walsh," she said. "Ma'am. When this comes out, and it's going to come out, the family needs to know someone is looking at it." "Yes, ma'am." A pause. "That's why I'm calling at 2 in the morning." She understood. She was part of the record now, whether she'd chosen that or not. The morning's events had put her at the center of something that was larger than a wrongful termination and larger than a military inquiry, and Walsh was making sure she understood the dimensions of what she'd walked into. "Okay," she said. "Get some sleep if you can. Tomorrow's going to be complicated." She put the phone down. She lay back. She looked at the ceiling she couldn't quite see in the dark. One patient, one family, 14 months of closed doors. And somewhere in this city, Daniel Mercer was awake in his house, knowing what the investigators had found, counting the hours until morning. She thought about the folder Aldrich had opened on the table. Sections 1 and 2, sufficient for the purpose. The sealed sections underneath, years of classified deployments. The things she didn't talk about in polite company. The version of her life that existed in documents with blacked-out lines and classification markers she still couldn't say out loud. She thought about Deb Farrow making a phone call 12 minutes before the convoy arrived. She thought about the attorney's call. They've been waiting for someone who wouldn't be pushed out. She hadn't planned to be that person. She'd taken the job at Summit Valley because it was a good ER and she needed to work, and she'd been tired of moving. She'd pushed back on Hale because she'd seen a woman dying on a gurney and she couldn't stop herself from knowing what that meant. She hadn't been trying to change anything. She'd just been trying to keep someone alive. The truck on the highway faded into distance. The apartment was quiet. At 7:45 the next morning, when she walked into the Summit Valley Medical Center ER for what she expected to be a meeting with General Aldrich, she was instead met in the lobby by Patricia Osei, whose face carried the specific controlled expression of someone who has been awake most of the night and has arrived at a decision. Beside her stood a man Claire didn't recognize. 60s, a suit that wasn't local, a briefcase that said attorney without the briefcase needing to say anything at all. And beside him, one of the investigators from the day before. "Ms. Bennett," Osei said, "thank you for coming in. Before you meet with General Aldrich, there are some things the board has authorized me to share with you." Claire looked at the three of them. She looked past them at the ER entrance, where the normal morning was already in motion. Nurses moving, a gurney rolling, the particular controlled chaos of a hospital that didn't stop for anything. "All right," she said. Osei opened a folder. The first page had the hospital's letterhead at the top and her name below it. "Last night," Osei said, "we received formal notification from the state medical board that they are reopening the case of a patient who died at this facility 14 months ago." She paused. "His name was Gerald Mott. He was 58 years old. He came to this ER with chest pain and was discharged without imaging. He died of a myocardial infarction 6 hours later." Claire held very still. "The physician who discharged him," Osei continued, "filed a report indicating the patient had refused imaging. The investigative team found correspondence last night suggesting that was not accurate." She stopped. "And suggesting that the incident report filed by the nurse on duty that evening was altered before it reached the record." The lobby was busy around them. Someone walked past with a coffee. A family came through the front entrance with a child in a stroller. Normal morning, normal hospital. "The nurse who filed that report," Claire said, "she left the hospital 10 months ago." Osei's voice was even and deliberate. "We have been in contact with her since last night. She is willing to provide a formal statement." Claire looked at the folder, at the name. Gerald Mott, 58 years old, 6 hours. "What do you need from me?" she said. The investigator stepped forward slightly. "We need a formal account of your clinical observations on the day of your termination, specifically regarding the events in Trauma Bay 1 and your subsequent interactions with Dr. Hale and Director Mercer." He paused. "And we'd like your assessment, as a clinician, of the documentation practices you observed during your 8 months at this facility." 8 months. She'd spent 8 months in this building, and somewhere in those 8 months, in the records and the schedules and the incident reports, were the traces of something that had been happening long before she arrived. "I'll give you whatever you need," she said. Osei nodded. She handed Claire the folder. Not the whole thing, a subset, several pages clipped together. "These are the board's preliminary findings from last night's emergency session. You should read them before the meeting with the general." Claire took the papers. She looked at the top page. Midway down, in the precise language of an institutional board finding, she saw Daniel Mercer's name, and beside it a phrase that had the specific weight of something written by lawyers who understood exactly what they were writing. "Willful suppression of clinical documentation." She read it twice. She looked up. Osei was watching her with the expression of a woman who had been in hospital administration long enough to have seen this before, who had perhaps been waiting to be in the position to do something about it, and who was only now, standing in this lobby at 7:49 in the morning, getting that opportunity. "There's one more thing," Osei said, "and this one came directly from the board's chair this morning before the session closed." She paused. "They're asking if you'd be willing to stay." The question sat in the air between them. Claire looked at the papers in her hands, at the name Gerald Mott, at the phrase willful suppression, at the whole sequence of the last 28 hours laid out in the space between what she'd expected this morning to be and what it was turning into. She was about to answer when Walsh appeared at the lobby entrance, moving with the kind of deliberate pace that meant something had happened. Ms. Bennett. He reached her in 6 strides. His face was controlled, but there was something in his eyes that hadn't been there yesterday. The general needs you, now. What happened? One of the overnight patients, Kavanaugh's team member, the one with the head lack. He was already moving back toward the ER. He arrested 20 minutes ago. They got him back, but He stopped walking. She'd already gone past him. She hit the stairwell door at a run. ICU was on the 4th floor. She took the stairs because the elevator was slower and she needed the seconds. Her shoes on the concrete steps echoed in the narrow space, and she counted floors without counting them, the way she used to count distance in the dark. Walsh caught up on the second landing. He was in better shape than she'd expected for a man his age, or maybe he'd had more practice running upstairs in difficult situations. "What's his GCS?" she said without slowing. 8 when they called it in, down from 12 at midnight. What happened in the 20 minutes before the arrest? Night nurse noted he was restless around 0300. At 0320, his pressure dropped. They called the rapid response at 0326. 26 minutes between restlessness and arrest. She pushed through the 4th floor door. That's not sudden. Someone missed something at 0300. The ICU was a different world from the ER. Quieter, more controlled. The kind of place where every alarm had a specific meaning and the staff moved with the precise economy of people who understood that economy mattered here. But there was a particular quality to the energy on the unit right now, the concentrated tension of a team that had run a code 20 minutes ago and hadn't fully come down from it. She found the room by the cluster of people outside it. Dominguez. That was his name, Walsh had told her yesterday. The soldier with the head lack who hadn't gotten his CT. She'd flagged it, and then the afternoon had become what it became, and somewhere in the handoff between shifts, something had slipped. She went in. He was 31 years old, she learned from the chart she picked up at the door. 5 years in the Army, 2 deployments, 1 prior hospitalization for a broken collarbone sustained in a training accident 18 months ago. He was 6 feet and change with the kind of build that came from doing difficult physical things regularly. And right now he was on a ventilator with a blood pressure that was doing something she didn't like, and a pupil on the left side that was not the same size as the pupil on the right. She looked at the attending, a hospitalist named Dr. Ravi Nkosi, 35, with the exhausted steadiness of someone who'd been running hard since the arrest and was still running. "Tell me where we are," she said. He didn't waste time establishing that she didn't technically work in the ICU. He'd been on the 4th floor long enough to know what had happened in the ER yesterday. Herniation pattern developing on the left. We think there's a bleed that was missed on the initial presentation. We've called neuro, but they're 30 minutes out. What imaging do we have? Nothing post-arrival. He was categorized as serious but stable yesterday afternoon. She looked at the pupil again, at the monitor, at the ventilator settings, which Nkosi had adjusted correctly. She noted that, stored it. He needs a CT head right now, she said, and if it shows what I think it shows, he needs an OR. Neurosurgeon is also 30 minutes out. Can she make it 30 minutes? Nkosi looked at the monitor, the honest pause of a physician calculating. I don't know. Then we need to know if there's anyone closer. She turned to Walsh, who was standing in the doorway. Is there anyone in your convoy with neurosurgical experience? Any of the military physicians? Walsh was already on his radio. She went back to the chart, looked at the timeline. 0300, restlessness. She thought about what that meant. A man trained to tolerate discomfort, trained to sleep in difficult conditions, trained to suppress complaints, who had been restless enough that a night nurse noticed. That wasn't normal post-injury restlessness. That was neurological. Who was the night nurse? She said. A woman at the back of the room raised her hand. Young, 2nd year at most, the specific look of someone bracing for blame. Tara Howell, I called it when his pressure changed. You documented the restlessness at 0300? Yes. Did you call the physician at 0300? A pause. I called the on-call resident. He said to monitor. There it was. The gap. Not Tara Howell's gap. She'd called, she'd documented. The residence. Claire filed it away for later because later was when it would matter, and right now the only thing that mattered was the next 15 minutes. Walsh lowered his radio. We have a physician with the convoy who completed a neurosurgery fellowship before commissioning, Dr. Major Elise Farrand. She's in the building. Get her up here. He was talking before she finished the sentence. Nkosi looked at Claire with the expression of a man recalibrating a situation in real time. You run trauma, he said. This is ICU. I know. She met his eyes. I'm not here to run your unit. I'm here because this is a military patient and Walsh asked me to come and I know his injury from yesterday. Everything else is yours. He considered that for a second. Then he nodded. Okay, doctor. Elise Farrand arrived 4 minutes later, which was faster than Claire had expected, which told her Farrand had either been already awake or had covered the distance between the lobby and the ICU at a pace that matched the urgency. She was 40, compact, with close-cropped hair and the specific focused calm of someone who had trained for exactly this kind of situation and found it clarifying rather than frightening. She looked at Dominguez. She looked at the chart. She looked at the pupil. Epidural hematoma, she said. Missed on initial. CT will confirm, but I'm not waiting for CT to tell me what his pupils are already telling me. She turned to Nkosi. What's your OR availability? OR3 is open. The team is on call. Call them in. Now. She was already moving to the bedside. I need a burr-hole kit, and I need it 5 minutes ago. Nkosi moved. The room reorganized itself around the new center of gravity. Claire stepped back. This was Farrand's now, and Farrand knew what she was doing. She could see that within 30 seconds of watching her work. The specific competence of someone who had operated in difficult conditions with limited resources and had learned to make fast decisions and live with them. She went to the doorway where Walsh was standing. Your physician is good, she said quietly. Yes, ma'am. He was watching Farrand with the particular expression of a soldier watching someone they trusted perform. She was in the 82nd before she went back for her fellowship. She's operated in places I can't tell you about. She's going to save him. He didn't answer right away. Then, you think so? I think so. She wasn't certain. Certainty was a lie you told yourself to function, and she'd learned to stop telling it. But she thought so, and in medicine that distinction mattered. If I'm wrong, I'll tell you. She stayed on the 4th floor for the next 2 hours. Not in the room, Farrand's team had it and didn't need her, but near enough to know what was happening. She sat in the family waiting area at the end of the ICU corridor, in a chair with one broken armrest, and she drank the worst coffee she'd had since her second deployment, and she waited. At some point, General Aldrich appeared and sat in the chair across from her. He didn't say anything for a while. Neither did she. This was one of the things she'd always appreciated about Aldrich, his understanding that silence was a legitimate response to a difficult situation, and that filling it was not always an improvement. Farrand's good, she said eventually. She is. He held his own terrible coffee in both hands. She asked to be in your convoy yesterday, when we got the call about the casualties. I almost said no. I wanted her here as backup, in case we needed surgical capability on site. He paused. She pushed back. Did she? Said if you were running the ER response, she'd rather be in the ER than waiting. A slight pause. She knew your name. A lot of people in this building know your name, Bennett, not from yesterday. She looked at her coffee. I've been out 4 years. Your protocols haven't been out 4 years. Your training materials haven't. The field medicine curriculum you developed for the 7th Medical, they updated it twice since you left, and both times they kept your foundational framework. He set his cup down. You didn't disappear when you left. You just stopped being visible. She thought about that, about the difference between those two things. What's going to happen today, she said. With the investigation? With all of it. He considered. The investigators will present their preliminary findings to the State Medical Board by end of week. The board action on Mercer will come through proper channels, which means it'll be slow, and it'll be thorough, and at the end of it, there won't be anything left to argue with. He looked at her. The patient case, Mott. That's the one that changes the character of this. Negligence is one thing. Falsified documentation covering a patient death is another thing entirely. Criminal. Potentially, yes. She thought about Gerald Mott, 58 years old, chest pain, sent home, dead in 6 hours. And somewhere in the hospital's records, an incident report with someone else's words in it where the night nurse's words should have been. The nurse who filed the original report, Claire said. The one who left. Is she okay? Aldrich looked at her with the slight shift in expression of a man who hadn't expected that question. I don't know, he said honestly. The investigators spoke to her last night. I'm told she was relieved that someone was finally asking. Relieved. 10 months of carrying it and relieved that someone finally asked. Okay, Claire said. From down the corridor came the sound of the ICU doors opening, and Ferrand appeared, still in her surgical gown, pulling off her gloves. She walked toward them with the post-procedure pace of someone who has been operating at maximum concentration and is allowing themselves to decompress one step at a time. She stopped in front of them. He's going to make it, she said. The air in the corridor did something, changed pressure almost. Aldrich closed his eyes for 1 second, then opened them. Thank you, Elise. She nodded. She looked at Claire. You flagged the CT yesterday. I did. If it had been done then, we'd have caught this 12 hours earlier. She said it without accusation, just as a clinical fact, the kind you stated clearly so that the same thing didn't happen again. The patient who categorized him as stable, that's something that needs to be part of the record. I know, Claire said. It will be. Farron went back toward the ICU. Aldrich watched her go. The board asked if you'd stay, he said. Osei told me. She told me too, about 20 seconds before Walsh came to get me. And? She turned the question over. The honest answer was that she hadn't decided, not fully, not in the way you decided things you were sure of. She'd spent 4 years making decisions on shorter timelines with less information than she'd wanted, and she'd gotten used to the space between a decision and certainty. But this felt different, bigger and smaller at the same time. I don't know if what's broken here can be fixed, she said. No, Aldrich agreed. You don't know that yet. But if it can be fixed, it's the kind of work you're good at. She looked at her coffee cup, cold. She'd stopped drinking it 10 minutes ago. That's not the same as the kind of work I want to do. No, he said again. It's not. He stood up because they both knew the meeting they'd come here for had been overtaken by everything else, and the meeting was now the corridor, and the coffee, and this. But wanting is a thing that changes, especially when you see what the alternative looks like. She thought about Kavanaugh's daughter, 7 months old, about Dominguez, who was going to wake up with a scar he hadn't had yesterday, and a story about why. About Gerald Mott, who was 58 years old and went home with chest pain and didn't get to wake up at all. Aldrich picked up his cup. Come down when you're ready. There are people who'd like to speak with you. He walked back toward the elevator. She sat in the broken chair in the family waiting area on the 4th floor of Summit Valley Medical Center, in the gray Oregon morning coming through the window at the end of the hall, and she looked at nothing for a while. She was still sitting there when Tara Howell, the night nurse who had called the resident at 0300 and documented the restlessness and done everything right and still been in a system where doing everything right wasn't always enough, appeared in the corridor on her way out after a 12-hour shift. She stopped when she saw Claire. Is he going to be okay? Tara said. Dominguez? Yes, Claire said. He is. The young nurse's face did something complicated. Relief and the aftermath of fear and something else. Something that lived in the space between those two things. I wasn't sure if I should have pushed harder at 0300 with the resident. You documented it, Claire said. You called it. That documentation is going to matter. Tara looked at her. Are you staying? People are saying... She stopped. I don't know what people are saying exactly, but there's something happening. Claire thought about how to answer that, about what was true and what was still in the process of becoming true and how to describe the difference. There's something happening, she agreed. Tara nodded and kept walking. Claire watched her go. She sat for another minute, then she stood up. She straightened her badge, the real one, the one Deb had gotten her, and she walked to the elevator and went back downstairs. The ER was busy. The morning was building toward its midday peak, the usual accumulation of people who had waited to see if something would get better on its own and had decided around 8 or 9 in the morning that it had not. She moved through the floor automatically, the way you move through spaces you knew well, checking and noting and filing. At the nursing station, Deb was on the phone. She looked up when Claire passed, raised 2 fingers, 2 minutes, and kept talking. Hale was at the chart rack. He saw her and straightened slightly, the body language of someone who had thought about what to say and hadn't landed on it yet. "Bennett," he said. "Hale." He looked at the chart in his hands. "Rosalind Tupper is being discharged today, from the surgical floor." She hadn't known that. "Good." She asked about the nurse. He kept his eyes on the chart. "The one who called the surgical consult. She wanted to know who it was." A pause that cost him something. "I told her." Claire looked at him. He wasn't meeting her eyes, but he wasn't hiding either. It was the posture of a man who had done something he thought was right and wasn't sure how it would land. "Okay," she said. "Also," he put the chart down. He looked at her directly now, which was clearly harder. "What I said yesterday morning, in the trauma bay. You don't need to—" "I was wrong," he said. Flat, clean, no decoration on it. Not about the chain of command. That's a real thing and it matters. But about you specifically. I was wrong. She held the moment. It would have been easy to accept it gracefully and move on, which was what she was inclined to do. But she'd learned that easy acceptance sometimes let people off cheaper than honesty served. "The patient almost didn't make it to the OR," she said. "I know." "If you'd sent her to CT—" "I know." His jaw was tight. "I know what would have happened. I've thought about it since yesterday morning." He paused. "I've been practicing 9 years and I've never had a nurse push back on me the way you did. It made me angry. I don't think the anger was actually about you." She thought about that, about what it took for a physician to say that out loud, in an ER, to a nurse he'd filed a complaint against less than 24 hours ago. Not a lot of people had the architecture for it. "All right," she said. "Then we're okay." He picked up the chart again. "Are you staying?" "I haven't decided." He nodded once, like that was the answer he'd expected, and went back to work. Deb appeared at her elbow. "You need to go to administration," she said. "Patricia Osei's assistant just called down, and—" She held out her phone. "There's something you should read." Claire looked at the phone. It was a news alert. Local Briar Falls outlet, posted 18 minutes ago. The headline was clean and factual in the way of a reporter who had gotten a tip and had been careful with it. Summit Valley Hospital director placed on administrative leave amid federal investigation into patient safety records. She handed the phone back. "It's out," she said. "It's out," Deb agreed. The ER continued around them. Monitors beeping, someone calling for transport, the ordinary noise of a place that kept moving because stopping was not an option it had been built for. Claire's phone buzzed in her pocket. She checked it. Unknown number, different area code than last night. She almost let it go. She had enough incoming right now, but something made her answer it. The voice on the other end was a woman's, older, steady in the particular way of someone who had been steadying themselves for a long time and had gotten very good at it. "Is this Claire Bennett?" the woman said. "Yes." "My name is Sandra Mott." A breath. "Gerald was my husband." Claire stopped walking. The ER moved around her. She stood very still in the middle of it. "Mrs. Mott," she said carefully, "I know who you are. They told me last night that someone was looking at Gerald's case again." Her voice was measured, but there was something underneath it that had been living under a lid for 14 months. "They wouldn't tell me who. But this morning there was a name in the news, and I looked you up. I read what happened yesterday." A pause. "I don't know if you can help me, but I didn't know who else to call." Claire looked at the badge on her chest. The real one. Her name in clean letters. Mrs. Mott, she said, I'm going to give you a number. It's for one of the investigators working on your husband's case. I want you to call it today, as soon as we hang up. She thought about Gerald Mott, 58 years old, chest pain, 6 hours. What happened to your husband should not have happened, and the people who made it happen are not going to be allowed to make it disappear again. The silence on the other end of the line was the silence of a woman trying to decide if she could believe that. How do you know? Sandra Mott said. It was a fair question. It was the only real question. Because I've seen what's in the records, Claire said, and because this morning a general walked into this hospital and the people who needed to be afraid of that are afraid. She paused. And because a nurse kept copies of documents for 6 months waiting for the right moment. And the right moment is now. Another silence, then quietly, all right. Claire gave her Walsh's number. She stayed on the line until she was sure Sandra Mott had written it down. Then she hung up. She stood in the middle of the ER for a moment. Deb was watching her from the nursing station. Hale was writing something in a chart. Through the ambulance bay doors, she could see the gray Oregon sky starting to break up, patches of blue showing through the cloud cover, the kind of October morning that looked like it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. She went to find Patricia Osei. She went to find out what staying would actually mean in the specific institutional contractual sense. What authority, what structure, what exactly she was being asked to do, and in exchange for what. Because she'd learned, in her other life, that commitments made without understanding the terms were how you ended up in places you couldn't get out of, and she wasn't going to make that mistake again. She was halfway down the administrative corridor when she heard it. Footsteps, rapid, from the direction of the main entrance. And then Walsh's voice carrying down the hall, controlled but carrying. Bennett, stop. She stopped. He reached her in 10 strides. His face had the expression she'd learned to read in the last 24 hours. The controlled urgency look, the one that meant something had shifted and she needed to know about it now. Mercer's attorney contacted the board this morning, Walsh said, 30 minutes ago. And? He's challenging the legality of the investigator's access to the hospital's internal communications, claims the federal inquiry exceeds its jurisdictional scope for a civilian medical facility. He paused. And he's filed a motion to have any statements or clinical observations made by you during the past 24 hours excluded from the record. She looked at him. On what grounds? He's arguing that your termination yesterday morning means you had no legitimate clinical standing during the emergency response, that anything you observed or documented in this hospital after 0900 yesterday is inadmissible in any administrative or legal proceeding. The corridor was quiet around them. She understood what this was. It was the move of a man who had been cornered and had found the one thread he could pull. Everything she'd done yesterday. The documentation, the patient observations, the clinical record she'd built through the course of the emergency. Mercer's attorney was trying to cut it loose at the root. Can he do that? She said. Walsh's expression didn't change. His attorney thinks he can. Our attorneys think differently. He held her gaze. But if this goes to a proceeding before the board reinstates your credentials formally, then there's a window, she said, where the argument holds. Possibly. She thought about Gerald Mott, about the documentation she'd reviewed, about Tara Howell's restlessness note at 0300, about 12 incident reports and 7 disciplinary actions, and 1 nurse who'd left medicine entirely and 1 who'd kept copies for 6 months. All of it sitting on the other side of a jurisdictional argument filed by a lawyer at 7 in the morning. What does Aldrich say? She said. Walsh's jaw moved slightly. The general says this is above his lane. She nodded. And you? He met her eyes. The specific expression of a sergeant major who has been in enough complicated situations to know that the right call was sometimes the one nobody wanted to make first. I think, Walsh said carefully, that a few things need to happen in the next 2 hours, in the right order, or this gets a lot more complicated for a lot of people. He paused. Including a woman in this city named Sandra Mott, who finally picked up the phone this morning. Claire looked at the end of the corridor. Through the window at the far end, she could see the parking lot where the military vehicles were still positioned, solid and present in the gray morning. She could see the flag at the hospital's entrance moving in the October wind. She turned back toward administration. Then let's make sure they happen in the right order, she said, and she walked. Patricia Osei's office was on the second floor, which meant passing through the main administrative suite, past the assistants who were answering phones with the careful tone of people managing a situation, past the closed door of the room that had been Mercer's and now had two people Claire didn't recognize standing outside it, in the specific posture of people who were there to make sure nothing went in or out. Osei was at her desk when Claire walked in. She had 3 phones in front of her and a legal pad covered in notes, and she looked like a woman who had slept 4 hours and was running on the specific fuel of someone who had decided this was the moment and was not going to let it pass. "Close the door," Osei said. Claire closed it. "You heard about the motion." "Walsh told me, 10 minutes ago." Osei set down her pen. "Mercer's attorney is named Philip Grasser. He is very good, and he filed that motion at 6:52 this morning, which tells me it was written last night, which tells me Mercer knew by midnight that the communication records had been accessed, and he spent the rest of the night figuring out how to neutralize the most dangerous witness." "Me?" Claire said. "You." Osei folded her hands on the desk. "The argument has technical merit. Your termination was processed through HR yesterday at 9:17. The military emergency began at approximately 10:40. There is a window of roughly 90 minutes where you were functioning in this facility without credentials or authorization, and Grasser is going to use that window to argue that everything you touched, observed, or documented during the emergency response is tainted." Claire sat down. "What about the temp badge?" "Deb got me a visitor credential, issued by an on-call administrator who did not have formal authority to reinstate terminated staff." Osei's voice was precise and without apology. "Grasser will argue it was procedurally invalid. The military requested my presence." "They requested it, but the hospital didn't formally authorize it." Osei paused. "I know how this sounds. I'm telling you the shape of his argument, not my opinion of it." Claire looked at the legal pad, at the notes she could read upside down. Names, times, statute references. "What's the board's position?" "The board's position, as of 40 minutes ago, is that they want this clean. They want the Mott case. They want the incident reports. They want Mercer's conduct, all of it clean and procedurally unassailable, because they know what's coming in terms of public scrutiny, and they cannot afford to have any part of this knocked down on a technicality." Osei picked up her pen again, "which means they need to close the window." "How?" "There are 2 ways." Osei wrote something on the pad. "Option 1. The board formally reinstates your credentials retroactive to the moment the military request was made, which would require an emergency vote and could be challenged by Grasser on the grounds that it's self-serving post hoc authorization. And option 2. Osei looked at her. "The military formally documents that your presence was requisitioned under Federal Emergency Medical Authority, which supersedes the hospital's administrative action." She paused. "General Aldrich has the authority to make that documentation. He indicated this morning that he is willing to do so, but it requires your formal consent because the documentation would make your involvement in the emergency response part of a federal military record." Claire understood the shape of it now. "Which means my service history becomes relevant to the record." "Sections 1 and 2, Osei said carefully. The general was clear about that. The sealed sections. The years she didn't talk about. The deployments that existed in documents with blacked out lines. She'd spent 4 years keeping those things in a separate compartment, and now they were about to become part of a hospital's administrative record in Briar Falls, Oregon. "What does it change?" she said. "Practically, for the investigation." "It changes everything," Osei said simply, "because the moment your military record is formally introduced, Grasser's argument collapses. You weren't a terminated civilian nurse who walked back in. You were a decorated military medical specialist whose expertise was requisitioned in a federal emergency. His whole jurisdictional argument goes away." Claire was quiet for a moment. "There's something else," Osei said. Her voice shifted slightly, still controlled, but with the particular weight of information that had been held for the right moment. She opened a drawer and placed a document on the desk. Not the board findings. Something different. A printout of an internal email chain, highlighted in 2 places. This came from the investigators this morning, she said. It was in the communication records they accessed last night. Claire looked at it. The first highlighted section was an email from Mercer to Dr. Preston Hale, dated 11 months ago. 4 lines. She read them twice. The last line read, "If Bennett continues this pattern, we document it and we move. Don't give her anything she can use." She looked up. "He knew," she said. "Before yesterday." "He'd been building a file on you for 3 months," Osei said. "The 3 complaints from attending physicians, they weren't unsolicited. He asked for them." She paused. "He was looking for a reason. He just needed a morning where you did something he could make stick." Claire set the email down. She thought about the sequence of yesterday morning. Hale's decision, her pushback, the complaint, the office, the badge. She thought it was a bad shift that escalated. It wasn't. It was a prepared move. "He planned it," she said. "He planned the termination, yes. He didn't plan the explosion." Osei's voice was dry in a way that wasn't quite humor, but was adjacent to it. That part was just bad luck for him. Something shifted in Claire's chest. Not anger. She'd passed anger sometime in the last 24 hours and come out the other side. Something colder and more useful. "Get Aldrich," she said. "I'll give consent for the documentation." Osei was already reaching for the phone. The next 40 minutes moved fast and required signatures, which was the most civilian thing about a situation that had become increasingly military in character. 2 of Aldrich's officers produced documents. The hospital's legal counsel, a thin man named Barrett, who had the perpetually concerned expression of someone whose job was to worry about things in advance, reviewed everything twice and asked 3 questions that Claire answered in complete sentences without hedging. Aldrich was present but largely silent, which was its own kind of authority. He signed where he needed to sign and let the process work. Grasser's motion was formally responded to by 11:20. Claire wasn't in the room when the response was filed, but Walsh found her in the ER afterward and told her the short version. The Federal Emergency Medical Authority documentation had been submitted, Aldrich's statement was attached, and the sections of her record that pertained to her medical qualifications and her role in the 7th Medical's field protocols were formally entered. His attorney went quiet for about 20 minutes, Walsh said. Then he filed a request for a continuance. "What does that mean for the timeline?" "It means he's buying time to find another angle." Walsh looked at her steadily. "But the investigators aren't waiting on the Mott case. That's moving separately through the state medical board, and Grasser can't touch it." She nodded. "There's one more thing," he said. There was always one more thing. She'd noticed that about Walsh. He delivered information in layers, not because he was withholding, but because he was sequencing, making sure each piece landed before the next arrived. She'd started to find it useful, rather than frustrating. "The physician who discharged Gerald Mott," Walsh said, "Dr. Alan Prescott. He's been on staff here for 6 years. He's been interviewed twice by the investigators. The first time, 2 days ago, he confirmed the documentation as written, that Mott refused imaging. And the second time, Walsh's expression shifted by about 3 millimeters. This morning, after the email chain was disclosed, he paused. He retracted his prior statement. She looked at him. He admitted to falsifying the record. He admitted that the documentation was not accurate. His attorney is negotiating the specific language. A pause. He also stated that the decision about how the incident report was filed was not made by him alone. Mercer. She didn't say it out loud. She didn't need to. She went back to work. This was the thing that kept her functional. The work was always there, the ER was always moving, and the patients didn't know or care about federal documentation and attorney filings and email chains from 11 months ago. A man with a kidney stone, a teenager with a possible appendicitis, an elderly woman who had fallen and was frightened and needed someone to explain what was happening to her in terms she could understand. And Claire sat with her for 4 minutes and did exactly that, which was 4 minutes she didn't have but gave anyway, because the woman's name was Dottie, and she was 81 and she was alone. She was finishing Dottie's intake paperwork when her phone buzzed. Text from an Oregon number she didn't recognize. 3 words. They're arresting him. She looked at it. She didn't move for a moment. Then she looked up and through the ER's interior window toward the main hospital corridor, and she saw them. Two state troopers and one of the federal investigators, moving through the hallway with the particular pace of people who had a destination and a warrant. She found out later, from Deb, who found out from the administrative assistant, who had been in the hallway when it happened, that Mercer had come into the hospital at 11:15, despite being on administrative leave. His attorney had apparently advised against it. He'd come anyway, which was either arrogance or a specific kind of panic dressed up as arrogance, and it had not gone the way he'd intended. The state troopers had found him in his office. The charge, as Deb reported it with the careful precision of someone who had gotten the exact language, falsification of medical records in connection with a patient death. She didn't go to watch. There was nothing to watch that she needed to see. She'd already seen the email. She already knew the shape of what he'd done. The arrest was the institutional machinery catching up to a reality that had existed for 14 months, and watching it happen in a hallway wasn't going to add anything to what she already understood. But she heard it. The sound of it moving through the hospital the way certain things moved, not loud but pervasive, the way a change in air pressure moved. Staff exchanging looks. Someone coming back from a break saying something to someone at the desk. The particular energy of a building where something significant has just occurred and everyone is processing it at slightly different speeds. Deb appeared at her elbow around noon. "He's gone," she said. "I heard. The board is convening again this afternoon." Deb picked up a chart, not because she needed it. "They want to talk to you." "What time?" 3. Claire made a note of it. "How are people doing?" she said. "The staff, the ones who've been here." Deb considered the question seriously, which was the only way Deb seemed to consider questions. "Scared," she said. "Some of them. The ones who knew things and stayed quiet. They're worried about what comes next." A pause. "And some of them are just tired. Tired of waiting for something to change and then watching it actually change and not knowing how to feel about it." "That makes sense. There's a nurse on the 3rd floor who filed one of those 12 incident reports 2 years ago. She was given a formal written warning a month later." Deb's voice was even. "She's been here for 9 years. She almost quit after the warning. She didn't because she needed the insurance." She paused. "She cried in the break room this morning when she found out about the arrest." Claire didn't say anything. Some things didn't have a response that was adequate. "I told her to write everything down," Deb said. "All of it, every detail she remembers." She looked at Claire. "Was that right?" "Yes," Claire said. "That was exactly right." The board meeting at 3 was in the main conference room on the 2nd floor, the large one with the oval table and the windows that looked out over the hospital's front entrance. Claire had never been in it before. It was the kind of room that had been designed to communicate stability and authority, and it was currently doing neither because 7 of the 9 board members were present in various states of serious discomfort, and the 2 attorneys on opposite sides of the table were generating the specific tension of people who had stopped being collegial approximately 18 hours ago. Aldrich was there. Ferrand was there, which surprised Claire slightly. Then she understood. Ferrand was the only one who had formally operated on one of the military patients. Her clinical standing in the room was different from Claire's. Barrett, the hospital's legal counsel, was there. 2 investigators. Patricia Osei at one end of the table, not quite running the meeting, but clearly the person to whom the room deferred. Grasser was not present. His office had sent a junior associate who looked like he was trying very hard not to look as young as he was. The board chair was a woman named Ruth Calloway, 70s, former surgeon, with the compressed directness of someone who had spent decades in operating rooms and had very little tolerance for peripheral motion. "Miss Bennett," she said when Claire sat down, "thank you for making time." "Of course. I want to be direct with you because the situation warrants it." Calloway looked at her over reading glasses that she hadn't needed to use yet. "The board has reviewed the preliminary investigative findings. We've reviewed the email chain. We've been advised of Dr. Prescott's revised statement, and we are aware of the situation with the Mott family." She paused. "We are also aware that your credentials were placed in a procedurally complicated position yesterday, and that complication has now been resolved through federal documentation." Yes. The board wants to offer you formal reinstatement, effective immediately, with full retroactive standing from the moment of the military's request for your services. Calloway folded her hands. We also want to discuss a more significant role. Claire waited. The position of Director of Emergency Trauma Services has been vacant for 14 months, Calloway said. The previous director departed under circumstances that are now part of the investigation. She held Claire's gaze. We would like you to consider taking it. The room was quiet. Director of Emergency Trauma Services. She understood what they were offering and why. Not just a job title, but a structural position, the kind that would give her the authority to do what she'd been doing informally and without standing since she'd walked into this building 8 months ago. The ability to set protocols, to build the kind of culture where a nurse didn't get a written warning for filing an incident report, where a patient with chest pain got imaged. She was about to speak when the door opened. One of the investigators. He came in without knocking, which told her immediately that whatever he was carrying was significant enough to override the protocols of a board meeting. He went directly to the other investigator at the table and handed him a tablet, said something low enough that Claire couldn't hear it. The second investigator looked at the tablet. His expression did something she'd learned to read in the last 2 days. The controlled urgency shift, the recalibration. He looked up. He looked at Calloway, then at Aldrich, then at Claire. We have a problem, he said. Calloway's voice was steady. What kind? The email chain we disclosed this morning, the Mercer-Hale correspondence. He set the tablet on the table so the room could see the screen. We pulled the full archive last night. There are 47 emails in the chain, and we reviewed the first 22 before the motion was filed. A pause. We finished the rest an hour ago. The table was quiet. There's a third party in the correspondence, he said. Beginning about 8 months ago. He looked at Claire directly. The emails reference you by name. They reference specific clinical incidents. And they include information about your military background that, at the time these emails were written, should not have been accessible to anyone in this building. Claire went very still. Someone provided Mercer with details from your service record, the investigator said. Not sections 1 and 2. Deeper. Things that are still classified. Aldrich's chair moved. A small sound, but everyone heard it. How detailed, Aldrich said. His voice had changed register. Not louder, more precise. The investigator turned the tablet to face him. Aldrich looked at the screen. Whatever he saw there, he held his face completely still for 4 seconds, which was the longest Claire had ever seen him work to maintain an expression. That, he said quietly, is not public information. No, the investigator said. It's not. The room understood what this meant, even the people at the table who didn't have military backgrounds. There was only one way for classified information from a sealed service record to end up in a hospital director's internal emails. Someone with authorized access to that record had put it there. Claire looked at the table in front of her, at her own hands. 8 months ago. Someone had provided her file. 8 months ago was the month she'd started at Summit Valley. The month she'd first pushed back on a clinical decision. The month Mercer, according to the email chain, had started building his case against her. Who sent it? She said. The investigator looked at her. His voice was careful in the way of someone delivering information they have not yet fully processed themselves. The sender address is a military domain, he said. We've traced it to a user account within the Army's medical administrative system. He paused. The account belongs to someone who served alongside you, someone who knew your full record. Aldrich stood up. It was a small movement. He simply rose from his chair. But it changed the temperature of the room the way a barometric change changed the air before a storm. I need the account name, he said. The investigator told him. Claire watched Aldrich's face. She'd known Warren Aldrich for 7 years. She'd been in rooms with him when things went wrong in ways that cost lives. She'd watched him receive bad news and classified briefings that didn't leave the room. She'd never seen his face do what it did in the 2 seconds after he heard that name. He turned to Walsh, who was standing near the wall. The look between them was the kind of communication that happened between people who had worked in close proximity for a very long time, compressed, dense, carrying more than the surface allowed. Walsh's jaw tightened by a fraction. Sir, he said. "Get me a secure line," Aldrich said. "Now." He walked out of the conference room without another word, Walsh behind him, and the door closed, and the room that was left behind was full of people looking at each other with the specific expression of people who understood that something had just expanded significantly beyond what they had thought they were dealing with. Claire looked at the tablet on the table, at the email chain on the screen, at the classified details about her own life, rendered in plain text in a hospital administrator's inbox. Someone who had served alongside her, someone who knew her full record, someone with access to the Army's medical administrative system who had decided 8 months ago that Claire Bennett needed to be removed from Summit Valley Medical Center, and had given Daniel Mercer exactly the ammunition to do it. She thought about the deployments she didn't talk about the things that lived in the sealed sections of her file, about the specific list of people who had known her in those years, in those places, under those circumstances. The list was not long. Calloway was watching her across the table. The board chair had the look of a woman who had managed crises for 40 years and was currently managing one of a type she had not previously encountered. "Miss Bennett," she said, "are you all right?" Claire looked at her. "I need 5 minutes," she said. She stood up and walked to the window. Outside, the October afternoon had finally made up its mind. The clouds had broken, and the sun was coming through in the sharp-angled way it did in Oregon in autumn, low and bright, and making long shadows across the parking lot. The military vehicles were still there. One of the soldiers was leaning against the lead vehicle, talking on a phone, completely still, except for his mouth moving. She thought about who knew. She thought about the sealed sections, about the specific operational details that were in there and nowhere else, about who had been present, who had been read in, who would have had both the knowledge and the system access. She thought about why. That was the part she didn't have yet. Not the who, because she was already narrowing that, already moving through the list with the same focused efficiency she brought to a trauma bay. The why was harder. Because taking down a civilian nurse in Briar Falls, Oregon wasn't a military objective. It wasn't strategic. It was personal. Something she'd done. Someone she'd known. Something from the years she'd spent trying to close away in a separate compartment and live around. Behind her, the conference room was very quiet. Her phone buzzed. She looked at it. Walsh. A text, not a call. 4 words. "The general needs you." She pocketed her phone and turned back to the room. "I need to step out," she said to Calloway. "I'll be back." The board chair nodded once, the nod of a woman who had learned when to ask questions and when to let a situation move at its own pace. Claire went through the door and into the corridor and followed the direction Walsh's text had come from, which was the administrative wing's east end, where a small conference room had been commandeered by Aldrich's people sometime yesterday and had not been relinquished since. She heard Aldrich's voice before she reached the door. Not the words, the register. The precise, controlled tone of a man who was very angry and was putting significant effort into not sounding it. Walsh was outside the door. He held it open without a word. The room had 2 of Aldrich's officers, a laptop connected to something external, and a phone on speaker that was carrying a second voice. Male, institutional, the particular flatness of someone at the other end of a secure line who had been caught off guard and was managing it badly. Aldrich was standing. He didn't turn when she came in. "I'm going to say this once," Aldrich said into the phone. "The account accessed Ms. Bennett's classified records on September the 9th. That is 8 months and 3 days ago. I want the authorization trail for that access on my desk by end of business today." The voice on the phone said something technical about system protocols and access logs and verification timelines. "I didn't ask about your timeline," Aldrich said. "I asked about mine." A pause, then, "Yes, sir." Aldrich hung up. He turned. He looked at Claire for a moment without speaking, which was unusual for him. She waited. "The account belongs to a Major Dennis Farrow," he said. The name landed wrong. She turned it over. "Farrow," she said. "He served in the 7th Medical, 18 months overlapping with your deployment period." Aldrich watched her face. "Do you remember him?" She did. That was the problem. She did remember him, and the remembering was not a straight line. It was a series of images and incidents that her brain had filed under a category she hadn't opened in a long time. Dennis Farrow. Logistics officer, not clinical. Quiet in a way that had read as competence and had turned out, on one specific occasion she had never fully resolved, to be something else. He was there for the Kessler extraction, she said. Aldrich's expression confirmed it without him saying anything. The Kessler extraction was in the sealed sections. It was the thing she didn't name in polite company. It had gone wrong in 3 ways before it went right, and the third way it went wrong had involved a decision that she had made and that Dennis Farrow had not agreed with, and 2 people had died, and the after-action review had cleared her completely, and Farrow had never said anything about it in any official capacity. He had apparently been saying things in unofficial capacities for the last 8 months. What was his access level, she said. Medical administrative. He processes records for the 7th Medical's Personnel Division. Aldrich's voice was precise. He would have had authorized access to sections 1 and 2. What he accessed goes deeper. He overreached. Significantly. Why? She said. Not to Aldrich specifically. More to the room. But Aldrich answered. The investigators found correspondence between Farrow and Mercer going back 10 months. It appears Mercer was already looking for leverage on nursing staff who were, in his words, generating institutional friction. Farrow found him through a mutual contact, a former hospital administrator who'd worked with someone in Farrow's unit. He paused. It appears Farrow approached Mercer, not the other way around. She absorbed that. He went looking for a way to use Mercer against me. That's how it reads. She thought about the Kessler extraction, about the decision she'd made. 2 people had died and her after-action review had cleared her, but clearing and forgiving were different things, and some people carried their unforgivingness for years without telling anyone, letting it metabolize into something harder and more purposeful. What happens to him, she said. Unauthorized access to classified records. Disclosure to a civilian, that's federal. Aldrich's voice carried no particular satisfaction. He will be court-martialed. Walsh had come into the room at some point. He was standing near the wall with the expression of someone who had heard this information before but was still processing it. There's more, Walsh said. She looked at him. The correspondence between Farrow and Mercer. The investigators went through all of it last night. Walsh moved to the laptop and turned the screen toward her. Farrow didn't just provide the background information. He coached Mercer on how to use it, which incidents to document, how to frame the complaints from attending physicians, how to build a paper trail that would make the termination look routine. He paused. He knew how you operated. He knew you'd push back on clinical decisions. He told Mercer exactly what to wait for. She looked at the screen, at the emails, at the specific detailed understanding of her clinical behavior that ran through the correspondence, the way she triaged, the way she escalated, the things that triggered her instinct to intervene. Someone who had worked alongside her, who had watched her in the field, who had turned that knowledge into a blueprint for someone else to use against her. It was a particular kind of violation. She'd been in dangerous situations. She'd been in situations where people had tried to hurt her through direct means, through violence, through operational failure. This was different. This was someone using her own competence as the mechanism of her destruction. The same instincts that had saved Kavanaugh and Dominguez and Rosalind Tupper were the ones Farrow had identified and handed to Mercer as vulnerabilities. She was quiet for longer than she intended. Bennett, Aldrich said. I'm fine, she said, which was mostly true. What do you need from me? A formal statement for the court-martial proceedings. Your recollection of Farrow's role in the Kessler extraction, specifically the decisions made and the after-action review. He held her gaze. I know what I'm asking. You're asking me to open the sealed sections. In a controlled context, military tribunal only. It won't be public. She thought about it. She'd spent 4 years not thinking about Kessler, not because she was ashamed of the decision, the after-action review had been clear, but because thinking about it cost something, and she'd decided the cost wasn't worth it. Now it was apparently going to cost her whether she thought about it or not. All right, she said. I'll give you the statement. Not today, he said. You have enough today. She almost argued. Then she recognized that he was right, which was a specific kind of irritating. Okay. She went back to the board meeting. Calloway looked at her when she came through the door with the expression of a woman who had run aboard long enough to understand that sometimes the relevant information was not in the room. "Are we resuming?" Calloway said. "Yes." Claire sat down. "I have an answer to your question." The room, which had been conducting a quiet conversation around the edges of its own tension, settled. "The role you're offering," Claire said, "Director of Emergency Trauma Services. I want to understand what that actually means before I answer. Not the title, the authority. What can I change? What requires board approval? What's mine to build?" Calloway looked at her steadily. "What specifically are you asking about?" "Incident report protocols. The pathway from a nurse filing a report to that report, reaching permanent record without anyone in administration having the ability to alter or suppress it. I want that pathway changed, and I want it binding." She paused. "And I want a formal review of every incident report filed in this hospital in the last 3 years, cross-referenced against the disciplinary records of the staff who filed them. If someone was punished for doing their job correctly, I want that corrected." The room was quiet. Osei, at the end of the table, was writing. "That's a significant undertaking," one of the board members said. He was in his 50s, a financial background. She'd read the board bios that morning. "Yes," she agreed, "and it should have happened 14 months ago, before Gerald Mott went home with chest pain and didn't come back." She said it without heat, which made it land heavier than heat would have. Calloway looked at the board member, then back at Claire. "Those conditions are acceptable," she said. "Pending formal board vote, which I am prepared to call right now." The vote took 4 minutes. 7 in favor, 0 opposed, 2 absent. The resolution was written, signed, and dated while Claire was still sitting at the table, which was either remarkable efficiency or the sign of a board that had drafted it before she came into the room. She suspected the latter. Outside the conference room, the afternoon had fully committed to being clear and bright, and the light through the administrative windows was the particular gold of late October in the Pacific Northwest. She stood in the corridor for a moment after the meeting, not going anywhere, just standing. Deb appeared from the stairwell. "How bad was it?" Deb said. "There's more to it than we thought." Claire looked at her. "There's someone inside the Army who helped Mercer build the case against me." Deb's face did something, took it in, processed it, arrived at an expression that was neither shock nor surprise, but something that recognized the specific shape of institutional betrayal. "Are they being dealt with?" she said. "Yes." "Okay." Deb seemed to decide that was sufficient. "Prescott is cooperating fully, by the way. The investigators have been with him since 10 this morning. His attorney worked out something with the state board. Reduced action on his license in exchange for a complete account." She paused. "He's given them everything." Everything meaning. Meaning the Mott discharge wasn't the only one. There are 2 other cases where documentation was altered after the fact. Deb's voice was flat in the way it got when she was managing something difficult by keeping the surface still. Both patients survived, but in both cases the altered record meant follow-up care that should have happened didn't happen, and both patients experienced complications that were avoidable. 3 cases, not 1. Claire looked at the floor for a moment. "The families," she said. "The investigators are making contact today." Deb paused. "Patricia Osei is personally calling each family. She asked if you'd be available to speak with them if they want to hear from the clinical side." "Yes," Claire said. "Of course." She went back to the ER. She had a shift that was technically hers, and the patients didn't know or care about board resolutions and court-martial proceedings and falsified records. She worked through the afternoon with the specific focus that came from having a lot of other things in her head that she was choosing not to look at directly. It was a familiar mode. She'd operated in it for years in much worse circumstances, and she was good at it. Around 4, Hale found her at the chart rack. He looked like a man who had been thinking about something for several hours and had reached a decision that he wasn't entirely comfortable with, but was going to act on anyway. "Prescott came to me," he said, 6 months ago. He told me there had been an issue with a patient record. He didn't give me details. He said Mercer had handled it." He held her gaze. "I didn't ask what handling it meant." She looked at him. "I'm telling you because you're going to be my director," he said, "and I'd rather you know I didn't ask than have you find out from someone else. She thought about that, about the specific ethical weight of not asking, which was different from participating, but not clean, not comfortable. "Did you know what not asking meant?" she said. His jaw worked. "I suspected." "Okay," she said. "That's it? You're telling me now you'll tell the investigators." She held his gaze. "What I care about going forward is whether you'll ask next time." He looked at her for a long moment. "Yes," he said, "I will." She believed him. She didn't know if that was good judgment or optimism, and she was willing to find out. At 5:17, Walsh appeared in the ER with the expression that had come to mean the day had one more thing in it. "Grasser withdrew the motion," he said. She looked up from her chart. "When?" "Hour ago. His office sent the formal withdrawal to the investigators." Walsh's voice carried nothing except the information. "And 20 minutes ago, Mercer's bail hearing was denied. The judge cited flight risk." She absorbed that. Bail denied meant Mercer was in custody tonight, in a cell somewhere in Briar Falls, Oregon, in a situation built largely from his own emails and a physician's retracted statement and 47 pieces of correspondence that had been sitting in a hospital's archive for the better part of a year. "What about Farrow?" she said. "Military police have him. He was taken into custody at 1400 at the base." Walsh paused. He didn't resist. His commanding officer said he seemed relieved. Relieved. She thought about that, about the specific weight of carrying something corrosive for 8 months, waiting for it to arrive somewhere, watching it arrive, and then finally being done with the carrying. She didn't have sympathy for him, but she understood the relief in the abstract, the way a thing landing, even badly, could feel different from a thing suspended. "There's one more thing," Walsh said. She waited. "The 2 cases Prescott disclosed, beyond Mott." He held his tablet so she could see the screen. "One of the families, the Tanner family, their son was 26 when he was treated here. He was discharged with what the altered record describes as a resolved infection. 3 weeks later, he was hospitalized at another facility with septic shock. He survived, but he lost 2 fingers on his left hand to tissue necrosis." Walsh paused. "His name is Marcus Tanner. He's 28 now. He's been living in Briar Falls the whole time. He had no idea the initial documentation from this hospital was wrong." She looked at the screen, at the name. Marcus Tanner, 28, 2 fingers. "He doesn't know yet," she said. "Osei's people are calling him in the next hour." She thought about what that call would sound like. 28 years old, living in the same city, going about his life with a left hand that was different from what it should have been, with no way of knowing it could have been otherwise. And then the phone rings and a hospital administrator's voice on the other end starts explaining. She thought about Gerald Mott's wife, who had spent 14 months believing the medical board had reviewed and closed her husband's case, about the night nurse who had left medicine, about Tara Howell at 0300 doing the right thing in a system that had been built to absorb and neutralize the right thing. 3 patients, 12 incident reports, 7 disciplinary actions, 1 nurse who'd left medicine entirely, 1 deceased, 2 harmed, and underneath all of it, a logistics officer in the Army's medical administrative system who had decided 8 months ago that a woman he blamed for 2 deaths in a classified extraction deserved to be pushed out of a hospital in Oregon, and had found a hospital director willing to do the pushing. She put the tablet down. "Walsh," she said. "Ma'am, when you go back to Aldrich, tell him I'll have the Kessler statement ready by end of week, whatever he needs, whatever format, however detailed. He can have it." Walsh looked at her. "He'll be glad to hear that. And tell him—" She paused. She wasn't sure how to finish the sentence. Then she decided on the true version. "Tell him I'm staying." Walsh nodded once. He pocketed the tablet and left. She went back to her charts. The ER was transitioning into evening, the shift change happening in the fluid way it happened when the unit was busy. Handoffs in the hallway, quick reports given standing up because there wasn't time to sit. She stayed to do her own handoffs properly, going through each patient with the incoming nurse, making sure nothing was summarized when it needed to be specific. The last patient on her list was an 11-year-old named Bobby with a forearm fracture from a skateboard fall who had been waiting 3 hours because the orthopedic consult was backed up. She'd checked on him twice and brought him a blanket and talked to his mother, who was holding it together with the focused determination of a parent who had decided their child needed calm more than they needed a witness to her fear. She went to check on Bobby one last time before handoff. He was watching something on his mother's phone, arm immobilized, face doing the careful thing kids did when they were in pain and were trying not to show it. "Ortho is coming," she told him. 20 minutes, maybe 30. They're going to take good care of you." He looked up from the phone. "Does it hurt more when they fix it?" "They give you medicine first," she said. "You won't feel it." He nodded. He seemed to be evaluating whether she was the kind of adult who told the truth, and he seemed to decide she was, which was its own particular thing, getting that judgment from a kid. She gave the handoff to the incoming nurse, an experienced man named Gregory, who had been at Summit Valley for 6 years and who, she had learned from Deb's copies, had filed an incident report in the first of those 6 years and been given a formal discussion, which was one step below a written warning, for it. He'd filed nothing since. She was going to change that. It was going to take time, and it was going to require rebuilding something structural, not just removing Mercer from the building. But it was the work, and she knew how to do it. She was at her locker, changing out of her scrubs, when her phone lit up. Patricia Osei. She answered it. "I've just come from a call with the state medical board," Osei said. Her voice was controlled, but there was something underneath it that Claire hadn't heard before. The specific tension of a person who has received information that they've been expecting, and that is worse than they expected anyway. "The board has expedited their review of the Mott case based on Prescott's statement. They've issued an emergency suspension of his medical license pending formal revocation proceedings." "That's fast," Claire said. "The board chair knows Gerald Mott's family," Osei said quietly. "Socially. She recused herself from the formal vote, but..." A pause. "She's been aware of the complaint for 14 months. She thought it was properly reviewed." Another pause. "She was told it was properly reviewed." The weight of that sat for a moment. "There's something else," Osei said. "The board's formal notification of Prescott's suspension will be public record as of tomorrow morning. Standard procedure." She paused. "Mercer's attorney has already received a copy. Grasser called me 20 minutes ago." "What did he say?" Osei was quiet for one beat. "He said his client wants to cooperate, that Mercer is prepared to provide a full account of the documentation practices in exchange for consideration from the DA's office." Another beat. "He also said, and I'm quoting directly, that his client has information about the hospital that goes beyond what the investigators have found so far. Information that would be, in Grasser's words, significant." Claire stood in front of her open locker with the phone in her hand. "What information?" she said. Grasser wouldn't specify. He said his client will only disclose it in a formal proffer session with the DA present and immunity terms on the table. Osei's voice had the quality of someone delivering something they don't yet fully understand. "He said it involves a member of the hospital's medical staff, someone who is still currently employed here." The locker room was empty. The sound of the ER was muffled through the door. Distant, filtered, the noise of the place continuing without her for the moment. She thought about the 3 cases, about 12 incident reports, about Prescott's full account, which had already disclosed 2 cases beyond Mott, about the word beyond. "When is the proffer session?" she said. "Tomorrow morning," Osei said. 9 o'clock? Claire looked at the wall in front of her, at the metal of the lockers, at her own reflection in the small mirror someone had taped inside the open door. Her face, tired, the scrub lines still visible on her neck, the badge clipped to clothes she'd been in since early morning. "Patricia," she said. "Yes." "What's the name of the medical staff member Grasser mentioned?" A pause. The kind of pause that was itself an answer. "He wouldn't say," Osei said, "but he said the investigators already know them." She thought about the people who had known, who had been in the building during the years the documentation was being altered, who had seen enough to file a report and hadn't, who had been present and silent. She thought about Preston Hale telling her this afternoon that Prescott had come to him 6 months ago, that he hadn't asked what handling it meant. She thought about the way he'd said "I suspected," past tense, which implied a present that had continued past the moment of suspicion, forward into months of continued practice. And she thought about the fact that Grasser had said the investigators already know them. And she thought about the investigators she'd spent the last 2 days watching work. And she thought about the specific quality of the look the lead investigator had given her in the boardroom that afternoon. Not at Osei, not at Calloway, but at her, when Grasser's information was mentioned. Her phone buzzed, a text. The lead investigator's number, which she had because Walsh had given it to her this morning. 3 words, don't go far. She didn't go far. She sat in the ER break room with a cup of coffee that she actually drank while it was hot, which was unusual enough that Deb noticed and didn't say anything, and she waited. The text had said, don't go far, and she understood that to mean something specific was coming and that she needed to be in the building when it arrived. It arrived at 7:43 in the form of the lead investigator, whose name was Garrett Solis, and who knocked on the break room door with the specific knock of someone who has been doing difficult things all day and has one more difficult thing left. She looked at him. "Hale," she said. Not a question. He sat down across from her. He had the kind of face that gave information in layers, professionally neutral on the surface, and underneath it, the particular fatigue of someone who had spent 2 days inside a bad situation and could now see the shape of all of it. "When we went through the communication records," he said, "we found a gap. Emails between Mercer and Prescott going back 4 years. But Prescott's involvement in the documentation alterations only started 14 months ago with Mott." He set his tablet on the table. "The emails before that point are different. They're not about patients. They're about staffing decisions, about specific nurses and residents who were flagged by Mercer as problems." He turned the tablet toward her. "Hale appears in those emails beginning 2 years ago." She looked at the screen, at the dates, at the language of it. Careful, indirect, the way people communicated in institutional settings when they understood that directness created liability. "He wasn't involved in the falsified records," Solis said. "Prescott confirmed that. Hale didn't touch documentation, but he was..." A pause. "He was informed. Mercer kept him informed about which staff members were being managed, and Hale provided feedback about clinical performance that Mercer used to build the files." She thought about yesterday morning, about the complaint Hale had filed after Rosalind Tupper, about the word patterns in Mercer's mouth, about how fast it had moved, the complaint, the call to the office, the badge. "He told Mercer what to wait for," she said. "The same way Farrow did." "Essentially, yes. Different information, same function." Solis watched her. "He didn't know about Mott. We believe that's true, but he participated in a system that made Mott possible, even if he didn't participate in that specific incident." She looked at the coffee cup, at the table, at the ordinary break room around her, the microwave with someone's initials marked on their container inside, the whiteboard with the schedule, the coffee maker that made coffee too bitter because nobody adjusted the grind and everyone had just accepted it. "What happens to him?" she said. "The board has been notified. He'll face a formal review of his clinical conduct. His hospital privileges are suspended pending that review." Solis paused. "Whether the DA pursues anything depends on what Mercer says in the proffer session tomorrow." "He told me this afternoon that he hadn't asked what handling it meant," she said. "When Prescott came to him about the Mott record." "I know, we have a partial recording of that conversation." He said it without apology. "The hallway outside the chart rack has a security camera." She thought about Hale's face when he'd told her. The discomfort, the decision to say it. She'd believed him, or believed in the partial version of him that the confession represented, and she'd told him they were okay. They weren't okay. That had been premature. "When you're running the trauma service," Solis said carefully, "you're going to need to work with people who stayed quiet. Some of them have good reasons. Some of them don't." He held her gaze. "That's going to be hard." "Yes," she said. "I know." He picked up his tablet. "The proffer session is at 9 tomorrow. Whatever Mercer gives us will determine the final shape of the charges." He stood up. "Thank you for staying available tonight." "Solis?" she said. He stopped. "The Marcus Tanner family. The Mott family. The third family." She held his gaze. "I want to be available to speak with them. Not officially, not as part of the investigation, just as a clinician if they want someone to explain what should have happened." He looked at her for a moment. "I'll pass that along." He left. She sat in the break room for another few minutes, finishing her coffee, letting the information settle into the rest of what she was carrying. Then she went home. She slept better than she had any right to, which was either a sign of physical exhaustion or of something resolving internally that she hadn't been aware was unresolved. She woke at 5:40, which was becoming a pattern, and lay in the dark for a few minutes before getting up. The proffer session happened without her. That was how it was supposed to work. She wasn't a party to the DA's conversation with Mercer's attorney, and she wouldn't know the specific terms until they were finalized. What she knew by 9:30, when Osei texted her a summary, was that Mercer had agreed to provide a full account of the documentation practices, naming every physician who had participated in record alterations and every instance he could specify, in exchange for the DA's agreement to consider the cooperation in sentencing. He had not received immunity. Grasser had asked for it, and the DA had declined. What Mercer had given them, in exchange for consideration rather than protection, was everything. 4 years of it, 5 physicians, including Prescott, 11 altered records across 3 patient cases, and the specific detail of how the incident report suppression had worked. The pathway from a nurse filing a complaint to that complaint being reviewed by Mercer and either absorbed, modified, or buried, depending on what it contained and who it named. Osei's text ended with 4 words. "The board has what it needs." She read it in the ER, between a pediatric asthma case and a man with a blood pressure of 190 over 110 who needed to sit down and talk about his lifestyle choices in a way that she was going to try to make constructive rather than scolding. She pocketed the phone and went back to work. The week that followed was not a clean resolution. It never was. Clean resolutions existed in the space between the last page and whatever came after, and she was living in the after. Preston Hale's hospital privileges were formally suspended on Thursday. He didn't fight it. His attorney released a statement saying he was cooperating fully with the board's review, and she believed that was true because Hale was, at his core, a man who understood when a position was indefensible and made the logical adjustment. It wasn't the same as integrity, but it was something she could work with eventually, in the long institutional sense of the word eventually. 3 of the 5 physicians named in Mercer's account surrendered their hospital privileges voluntarily before the board could act. The other 2 retained attorneys and requested formal hearings, which was their right, and which meant the proceedings would take months. That was fine. Months meant it was documented and moving, which was more than it had been a week ago. The state medical board revoked Prescott's license on Friday, which was the fastest license action Osei said she'd seen in 20 years of hospital administration. The board chair, who had recused herself from the formal vote but had apparently communicated her view of the timeline to her colleagues with some clarity, did not comment publicly. She didn't need to. Mercer was formally charged on Friday afternoon. The charges were read in a courtroom in Briar Falls with a reporter from the local paper in attendance and 3 television cameras outside. And the charges included falsification of medical records, obstruction of a state medical board investigation, and this was the part that Solis had told her about the night before, quietly, as a courtesy. 1 count of conspiracy in connection with the unauthorized disclosure of a protected person's records, because the investigators had built a sufficient chain between Mercer, Farrow, and the classified information to support a conspiracy charge in federal court. She didn't watch the news coverage. She was working when it aired, and she learned the details from Deb, who had watched it on her phone in the supply room and had come out with the specific expression of a person who had waited a long time for something and was allowing themselves, carefully, to feel it. "It's done," Deb said. "Most of it," Claire said. "Most of it," Deb agreed. She understood the distinction. Dennis Farrow's court-martial proceedings were initiated the following week. Aldrich called her himself to tell her. Not Walsh, Aldrich, which meant he was treating it with the weight it deserved. The statement she'd given about the Kessler extraction had been received, reviewed, and accepted into the record. The after-action review clearing her decision had been re-entered alongside it. The 2 soldiers who had died in the extraction were named in the proceedings, which was the only thing she'd asked for. Not for herself, but for them. They deserved to be named. She didn't ask Aldrich what Farrow had said in his own statement. She wasn't sure she wanted to know yet. Maybe someday. The formal ceremony was General Aldrich's idea, and she'd tried to talk him out of it twice. "It's not necessary," she said, the second time, standing in his temporary office at the hospital, which he had apparently decided to maintain for the duration of the investigation, despite having no formal reason to still be in Briar Falls. "It's not about necessary," he said. "It's about the record, and about the people in that building who need to see what they were part of." She understood what he meant by that. The staff who had stayed quiet, the nurses who had filed reports and been warned, Tara Howell at the nursing station, Gregory, who had filed one report in 6 years and not another. They needed to see something, not a speech, not a declaration, but a visible institutional acknowledgement that the thing they'd been told didn't matter had, in fact, mattered enormously, that someone in authority had noticed. She stopped arguing. The ceremony was in the hospital's main atrium on a Thursday morning, 2 weeks after the day she'd been walked to the front entrance by 2 security guards who hadn't been able to meet her eyes. The atrium was large enough for most of the hospital's day staff to be present, and most of them were, not because attendance was required, but because word had moved through the building the way certain things moved, and people had chosen to be there. She stood in front of them in her scrubs, because Aldrich had asked if she wanted to wear something else, and she'd said no, because scrubs were what she wore when she did the work, and this was about the work. Aldrich spoke briefly. He had the gift that certain senior officers had, the ability to say something significant in fewer words than you expected, without it feeling abbreviated. He talked about the 37 casualties who had come through Summit Valley's doors and were alive because of the clinical decisions made in those hours. He talked about the standard of care that those decisions represented. He didn't talk about her military record beyond confirming that it existed and that it was distinguished, because the sealed sections were still sealed, and that was as it should be. Then he opened the box he'd been holding. The award was the Army Civilian Service Commendation Medal, which existed for exactly this kind of circumstance: decorated military medical personnel serving in civilian roles. She'd known it was coming. Aldrich had told her, not as a surprise, but as a matter of record, because she deserved to know what she was walking into. She hadn't expected the weight of it, not the physical weight, the medal was small, but the specific gravity of standing in a room full of people who had watched her be escorted out of the building 2 weeks ago and receiving something that made the terms of that removal permanently, publicly wrong. She kept her face still. She was not going to cry in the atrium of Summit Valley Medical Center. That was a decision she had made before she walked in, and she was maintaining it by will alone. Aldrich pinned the medal and stepped back and saluted. She came to attention, old reflex, clean and automatic, and returned it. And then the room did something she hadn't prepared for. It started at the back, somewhere near the elevator bank, with a single pair of hands. Then another. Then a sound that built from the back of the atrium forward, filling the space until it wasn't just clapping. It was the sound of people who had been waiting to say something they didn't have words for, and had found this instead. She stood in the middle of it and looked at the room. At Deb Farrow, who was clapping with the contained satisfaction of a woman who had kept copies for 6 months and had been right to. At Patricia Osei, who had stayed at her desk for most of 2 weeks and had spent considerable personal capital making the right calls. At Ravi Nkosi, who had let her direct the ICU response without pulling rank. At Farand, who had come in on a military consult and stayed for the week because there were still military patients in the building. At Gregory, the nurse who hadn't filed a report in 5 years. He was clapping. His face was something complicated. Not simple joy, not simple relief. More like the look of a person realizing that a choice they had been afraid to make might, going forward, be possible. That was the one that almost got her. She held it. She'd been asked to say a few words and she'd prepared something, and standing here now she understood that the prepared version was wrong, too constructed, too finished. She set it aside. "I was a combat medic," she said. The room quieted. "Before I was here, in places I can't fully describe. And the thing they teach you, the first thing, the thing that comes before anything else, is that your job is the patient, not the rank, not the paperwork, not who has authority over what in the current organizational structure. She paused. The patient. She looked at the room, at the nurses who had stayed quiet too long, at the ones who hadn't. I pushed back on a physician decision 2 weeks ago because a woman named Rosalind Tupper was going to die if I didn't. That's why I did it. Not because I wanted to cause problems, not because I thought I knew better in some general, abstract sense. She paused. Because she was right there in front of me and I had information that was relevant and I chose to use it. She stopped. Let the room be quiet for a second. The people in this hospital who filed incident reports and were warned or disciplined or pushed out, they were doing the same thing. They had information that was relevant to patient safety and they chose to use it through the proper channels, and the channels were broken. That's done now. She held the room's gaze as evenly as she could. But it only stays done if we're all willing to keep using the channels, keep filing the reports, keep having the difficult conversations. A pause. I'm going to spend the next year making sure those channels work the way they're supposed to, and I'm going to need people who are willing to use them. She stopped there. She didn't have a clean closing line, and she wasn't going to invent one. The room started again, louder this time. Afterward, in the corridor outside the atrium, Sandra Mott found her. She was smaller than Claire had imagined from her voice on the phone. 60s, neat, with the particular self-possession of a woman who had been managing grief for 14 months and had gotten very practiced at appearing functional. She was with a man who was probably her son, 30s, her eyes. I wanted to meet you in person, Sandra said. I'm glad you came, Claire said. They explained what should have happened, with Gerald. She held Claire's gaze with the directness of someone who had decided that looking away was no longer worth the effort. The night nurse, the one who filed the original report. I spoke with her. Claire waited. She cried, Sandra said. She apologized. She said she'd been trying to find a way to reach us for a year. I know. I told her it wasn't her fault. Sandra's voice was steady in the way of something that had been worked at. It wasn't. She did what she was supposed to do. The fault was with the people who took what she did and made it disappear. She paused. I wanted you to know I understand that distinction. Thank you, Claire said. And then, because it was true and Sandra Mott deserved the truth without softening. I'm sorry it took this long for someone to pull it back into the light. Sandra looked at her for a moment, at the metal on her scrub top, at her face. He would have liked you, she said. Gerald. He was an ER nurse, did you know that? Before he retired. A small, complicated something moved through her expression. He always said the best people in any hospital were the nurses who knew when to push back. She reached out and squeezed Claire's hand once. Then she and her son walked back toward the atrium, and Claire stood in the corridor and breathed for a moment. Marcus Tanner was there too, somewhere. She'd been told he would be, that he'd asked to come after Osei's team contacted him. She didn't find him that morning. She learned later that he'd stood in the atrium through the whole ceremony and had left without introducing himself, which she understood. His presence was enough. His presence was its own statement about what this day meant beyond the institutional record of it. She went back to work at noon. Because the ER didn't stop for ceremonies, and there were patients who needed someone who would push back when it mattered and document everything and stand on the sidewalk in October with nowhere to be and still, after all of it, choose to walk back through the door. The afternoon was ordinary in the best possible way. A sprained ankle, a migraine, an elderly man with pneumonia who needed admission and who asked her 3 times if she was sure, and who she reassured 3 times with the patience that came from understanding that some people needed to be told more than once. Kavanaugh was discharged that week. She didn't see him go. She was in a trauma bay when it happened, but he left something at the nursing station. She found it at the end of her shift. A piece of paper torn from a notepad with handwriting that was careful in the deliberate way of someone who knew their handwriting wasn't their strongest skill and was trying anyway. My daughter's name is Mia. Thank you for making sure she still has her father. Kavanaugh. She folded it and put it in her pocket. She drove home through Briar Falls in the early evening light, the October sky doing the specific thing it did at this time of year in this part of Oregon. All rose and pale gold, and the last of the afternoon burning off at the edges. She had her window cracked. The air was cold enough to be bracing, and she needed bracing. She thought about the things that had happened and the things that hadn't fully resolved yet. Hale's review would take months. The physicians who'd requested formal hearings would slow things down. The Pharaoh court-martial would be handled by people who understood military law better than she did, and her role in it was already largely complete. There would be a period of awkward rebuilding in the hospital, the institutional kind, where you were working with people who carried the weight of what they'd done and not done, and you had to figure out how to build something functional from that without pretending the weight wasn't there. None of it was going to be clean. None of it was going to be finished on any single day. But here was the thing she'd learned. In the field, in the years before, and in the last 2 weeks in a hospital in Oregon. Clean wasn't the point. Finished wasn't the point. The point was the direction of movement, whether the pressure was building toward the right things or away from them, whether the people with the information were using it, and whether the systems were set up to receive it when they did. Direction. That was the thing you could control. She'd spent 8 months watching the direction of Summit Valley Medical Center and knowing it was wrong, and she'd pushed back on a single physician decision in a trauma bay, and the whole weight of what had been building finally had something to push against. She hadn't planned that. She'd just done the job. That was the part she wanted to remember. Not the ceremony, not the medal, not Aldrich's salute. Though those things mattered, they mattered on the record in ways that protected her and changed what was possible. But the part that had actually changed anything was a woman at a nursing station looking at a patient whose pressure was dropping and choosing to say what she saw out loud to the person who had the authority to act on it, in a room full of people who were waiting to see what would happen. It was always that small. The thing that changed everything was always exactly that small. She parked in her lot, sat in the car for a moment the way she had 2 weeks ago, the night Walsh called about the communication records. Except 2 weeks ago, she'd been sitting in the dark, trying to understand the shape of what she'd walked into. And tonight she was sitting in the last of the October light, tired in a clean way, knowing exactly where she was. She had patients tomorrow. She had an 8 o'clock meeting about the incident report protocol redesign, which she had been thinking about for most of the week and had opinions about. She had a conversation she still needed to have with Hale that was going to be uncomfortable and necessary and couldn't wait much longer. She had work. Specific, particular, difficult, essential work. She got out of the car. There's a version of this story where someone else pushed back that morning in Trauma Bay 1, where some other nurse saw Rosalind Tupper's blood pressure and made the call and the whole sequence unfolded around a different center. Maybe. But that's not what happened. What happened is that the person who saw it was someone who had spent years in places where not saying what you saw out loud cost lives, and that experience had made something in her that couldn't be quiet when a patient was in front of her. You don't have to have a classified file or a military record to have that. You just have to have been in a room where silence cost something, and to have decided that you were not willing to let it cost again. The people who dismissed Claire Bennett as just a nurse were wrong about the word just. There is no just in front of the word nurse. There is no just in front of anyone who shows up every day and does the hard thing and keeps doing it even when the building around them is broken, even when the channels don't work, even when the person with authority uses that authority to tell them to be quiet. The quiet ones are not the ones who stay silent. They're the ones who do the work without needing to be recognized for it, who carry the weight without advertising the carrying, who push back not because they want to be seen, but because the patient is right there and they cannot look away. That was who Claire Bennett was. That was who she had always been. And the morning they tried to take it from her was the morning it became impossible to ignore.